Hello. How's it going, guys? Serious guy, please. I keep trying to get verified in your Discord, but it won't let me through. What is your... I don't know what your thing is, brother. Right here? Hello. Oh, there it is. Hello. There's the fucking... How's it going? Econo boy in the fucking background.
Guys.
How's it going? Serious guy, please. I keep trying to get verified in your Discord, but it won't let me through. Serious guy, please. I keep trying to get verified in your Discord, but it won't let me through.
I have two of them up?
Your... My God. Okay, well, there we go. No idea how this is gonna go, boys. Like I said, guys, I don't know. No idea how many. I don't get a lot of donations. No idea how many donations that I'll get. But if you want to donate, they're all gonna go to the charity that I linked in the pinned comment. So feel free to donate. That's where I'm gonna donate. I guess when you donate, I'll match the, like, you donate $1 and I'll donate $1 out of my bank account, so it all gets to the program. Obviously, you can donate directly to the link if you want as well. Donating here just allows me to. Well, actually, does it allow me to keep? No, it does allow me to keep track because I can check my donations here and just add them up at the end of the stream. And I'll do some kind of match myself. So if it's anything like Destiny's last combos about socialism, he will fiddle with definitions for 2 hours. I mean, I don't know. I hope that doesn't happen. I'm just going to, like, stubbornly avoid that debate as much as possible because I don't really think it's very interesting. Personally speaking, that's just me. What up, Econo bro? Hello, Andy. Is that the Andy in my chat? Really? Can't believe it. Capital Science, will it be about policies or semantic debates on socialism? Yeah, I'm going to just explicitly avoid the semantic debate as much as possible. I don't know that Dusty wants to do that, but anyway. The only reason I'm doing this is just because I feel like I don't know. This all started, I think, originally from Destiny, kind of in some senses, I think, misrepresenting my positions, and so, anyway. Destiny said that he didn't prepare, he hasn't read the Substack, and he thinks this will be boring. I don't know. Maybe it will be boring. No idea, guys. It might be boring to, talk about economics, I guess. I don't know. That's the story of me channel. I'm about to hop into Wix thing and start doing my audio check. Before I do that, though, take a big drink from my apparently comically large water bottle. Socialism, why don't you go out and socialize with someone you love? Why don't you socialize some bitches into your life? Ninoy. I'm just kidding, Ninoy. Destiny is a knobhead for real. White Knight, I am considering banning you because you may have revealed that you're British on accident. We don't allow that in this community. It's definitely going to be lost in semantics at some point. I mean, I hope not, but whatever. You have a paint can and Hutch has a vase. Dude, okay. Hutch's water bottle does look weirder than mine, if you ask me. He literally looks like he's drinking from a flower vase, okay? Ugh. The only reason it's comically large is because I don't want to have to get up and refill it all the time. I'd rather just carry around a heavier object. Anyway. About to get in with Wick and do some audio checks.
Hello.
Hey, my dude. 1 second. Let me do my camera for you.
Yeah,
and by the way, my stream can hear you.
Oh, okay. I'm just letting you know on my end we're fine. But if you're streaming, all good. What's up, brother?
Oh, nothing much. Nothing much.
Ready for today?
Ready as I'll ever be. I don't know.
You lost the flags, bro. Like you didn't go meme it up this time? Okay.
No. These are just, this is my normal background, so what with that. But my camera looks a little bit.
One-on-ones are always interesting. There's a much higher ability to have a good back and forth, but there's more of a risk that it kind of just peters out a little bit. But I think that we'll be fine. I got some combo breaker questions for us in case we do something to kind of like spark things up. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just an hour, hour and a half kind of natural
Yeah.
discussion, that's fine with me. It's not really a big deal.
Do you mind if we take callers after?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, again, depending on how long it goes.
Yeah.
We'll
Like I said, if it only lasts for like an hour and a half naturally, then it's yeah, we can do
It's
callers.
what
It's
it
not a big deal.
is, right? It's what it is. So, yeah, we'll see. But it's gonna be fun. I'm excited for it, and maybe we can get to the heart of some of these things. You've been doing the rounds on this. I saw you briefly on Sitch and Adam. I didn't see it, but I heard you debated Ryan Mullally on this as well.
Yes,
So
Ryan was
you
very irritating post debate with his Twitter.
Uh-oh,
But
what did you do?
I don't know. I find it very strange the way that Ryan interacts with people personally. It's like very like I feel like it's very cordial, but then it's like,
Okay.
oh, you're immoral, you're un-American. Like his Twitter and his 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 like
Okay.
not
I
in
know. I
person.
think I see what you're saying. So he's
Yeah.
acting one way to your face, but then as soon as it gets on Twitter, it acts another way. Is that the
Look, I mean, I don't really care.
vibe?
Ryan's a grown man, but it does seem rather strange to me. I mean, I don't know. He called my I don't know. He won't. I just find it strange that you would call my system immoral, but you would and you'd call in some sense like me an immoral person, but you wouldn't do the same thing with Trump, right? When I feel like he calls me un-American, but he doesn't call Trump un-American, right? And it's like, okay, dude, like
That is a bit of
what
an
am I gonna
odd delineation.
do? Anyway,
But
what can I do? All I did was try to talk about property rights. I thought I did all right, but 1 second,
oh,
I'm gonna mute myself.
take your time.
Let's see. Sorry, $20. June Noob getting it started. Wick is useless. You should just speak to Destiny one-on-one. What a way to start out, June Noob. $20 to say Wick sucks. Okay, I don't agree. I like Wick, but sorry, Wick. I got donated. Somebody donated $20 to tell me that you suck.
Ooh,
And
me specifically?
specifically you, Wick. Yeah. They said
They're concentrating on me sucking when Trump is in office. What is going on? Okay.
that's a good
I
point.
see how
That's a
their
good point.
priorities go.
That's a good point.
Hey, it made you some money though, right? So here we are.
Yeah.
I'll give Mr. Destiny the link. When he gets here, we'll start the show.
Okay.
Speak of the devil. Oh, well. Okay. We'll see when he gets here. I mean, he's here, obviously, but more in body than in spirit at this point. But, we'll see. So I have gone live on my end. Now the people can see you and hear you and all that beautiful stuff. So we're getting ready. Gang, if you're listening in chat, I have a poll, capitalism on social or socialism. And I'm going to take this twice. So I'm going to take it right now at the beginning. And then nearer to the end, we're going to run another one and see if your minds have changed and how they've changed, right? So I'll keep this one up for a little bit as people get in here, as this gets started and all that. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Is your audience excited for this, Cowboy?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, they're looking forward to it. it should be an interesting discussion, and I'm doing a charity stream on my end, so people can donate.
What's
And
charity for?
the World Food Program. So all the money going right to them. And I don't know how much I didn't want to commit to matching it all. It's like, what if we raise 10 grand? And I was like, I don't have 10 grand. So I'll do some kind of a match myself, but I didn't want to guarantee what it would be.
A threshold max or a limit max.
Oh, maybe I should have just,
the
like,
first 100 or first
up to 500
whatever.
or something. Yeah, but
Well,
I
yeah.
don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I don't know. I usually get very little, $100 worth of donations or something. So,
hey, no, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, we'll see.
Good. Well, we got visual. We can't see or hear him, and he can't see or hear us, obviously. That's great. This is wonderful content, gang. I'm ready. Not down. We should still be up.
Did you kick your thing again, Wick? God damn it.
No, I fixed that. No, we're not down. We're just not saying anything because Destiny is muted on his end. His Discord is muted, and I'm waiting to start until he can actually hear us and hear what we're saying. Oh, thank you for the $2, by the way.
Thank you for the $2.
Oh, sorry, he's here. Welcome to the show. We have an audible connection now. So let's just get this on the road and we'll get to it. So welcome. Yet another episode of WIC TV. It's a cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. Econoboy asked me to set this up because he felt that it would be a more productive discussion to have kind of like a more...
Wick, correction already. Moderator interference. The people asked for this to be set up. The people did.
Okay. People. Okay.
So
the socialism strikes already. Okay, well, voice of the people, Econoboy, why don't we do this? We're just debating on capitalism and socialism today. And the first question I have for Econoboy, and we're going to give the mic to him, is when you say you're a socialist, what do you mean? Go ahead.
I thought we were doing opening statements.
This is your opening statement.
Oh, okay,
go ahead.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about my position, so I figured doing this discussion directly would, help clear some of that up at the very least. I know a lot of people don't fucking listen, okay? So hopefully they will today. To answer that question right off the bat, socialism is when you collectively own the means of production, and by the means of production, that's basically businesses. I think that's what socialism is. That's the broadest kind of tent of socialism that I think is the biggest through line of socialist thinkers. And I guess to go on with my opening statement, even though it was phrased as a question, why is this preferable to capitalism? So I fundamentally now describe myself as a socialist because I came to a developed egalitarian view where egalitarianism is something that I think is intrinsically valuable for a number of reasons. We can relate to each other as equals. I think that's a good thing, morally speaking. I think that the distributional principle of essentially equal access to advantage, where advantage is welfare and resources, established by G.A. Cohen, I think those are sensible egalitarian views as well. And capitalism kind of violates this in a number of ways. It violates it because of the private ownership of the means of production, sort of unequally distributing wealth in society, right? And unequally distributed wealth means unequally distributed capital income, but it also means unequally distributed power in society, right? Wealthy people have a lot more power. They have a lot more, as Ryan Mullally would say, capacity, but I would just say freedom. And I think that that's probably not good, especially on balance of your other values. Essentially, if we can create a more equal society without destroying the economy or, destroying innovation or something like that, then I think that we should do it. And then maybe you'd sacrifice some level of like utility or something for some like radical increase in equality, perhaps. And so I think that that's just something that is important. I think that inequality itself needs a reason to exist, and our current unequal society just doesn't have a good enough reason, if you ask me. Now, To go on to finish out, I'll talk about my model very briefly. I think that the capital allocation, profit motive, like these kind of competitive processes are important. The way that capitalism kind of works today is that we have huge asset managers that allocate a huge proportion of the capital in society. And so basically what I'm saying is we should transition that process, that capital management asset process, from private hands to public hands in the form of sovereign wealth funds and holding corporations, where we can eat up a large chunk of the economy, if not the whole economy, if things just end up working out really, really well by doing this. One small caveat before I, give it over to Wick and Destiny is when I reference countries, I've heard people say that I said this. I've never said this, and I won't say it today. I don't think that the Nordic countries are socialist countries, okay? I think that socialism is when you collectively own the means of production. Societies exist on a spectrum between total private ownership and total collective ownership, the socialist ideal, the capitalist ideal. The Nordic economies, the reason I reference them is because they've engaged in a process of socializing at least a very large chunk of their economies. And we can see kind of the fruits of that, where they have reasonably decent levels of economic growth, employment, good unionization, things like that, high equality. And I think that those are just good examples of the process where I want to move society towards.
Okay, well, thanks for being here. Destiny, why is capitalism the superior system to whatever Econoboy just said?
Because capitalism is based. I just want to start off by saying that I spent a lot of time on Amazon because I was going to respond to Econoboy's horrible appropriation of violent communist flags and other stuff in the background. I was going to buy a bunch of Nazi shit, and they don't actually sell Nazi flags on Amazon. So I don't appreciate that. I feel like it's very one-sided in how they run things over there. When it comes to like a larger discussion on this, I don't know if I need to clarify this or not, but I guess just for anybody listening who doesn't catch everything on every platform, obviously there were a lot of heated debates between me and Pisco and Econoboy and other members of different communities having to do with like leftists and tankies and bad actors and everything. Just to clarify for the 50 millionth time, I don't think Econoboy is a secret tanky. I don't think he's secretly trying to be subversive or doing things. I do disagree, I think fundamentally, with a lot of his platform, but not in the same way that I would say that like other like Marxist-Leninists are bad faith actors trying to worm the way into the system to destroy everything in a way that they're not upfront about. Just, I guess, for anybody that needs to hear that or isn't clear of that. So I guess our conversation will probably revolve around a few things in this debate or conversation, whatever we call this. So I think the first issue I have is I think there's like an unclear vision of what socialism actually is or means. I think it's kind of ironic, or not ironic, but funny, I guess, that Econoboy kind of started off clarifying, what his version of socialism is, that he doesn't think that Nordic countries are socialist. And it seems like that on one hand, you want to say, not Econoboy in general, but on one hand, like people want to say that they're socialists, but then you fight so much against like what socialism means or what it doesn't mean that the label starts to become meaningless. And I think that the issue is that it allows for a lot of bad faith actors to come in and kind of usurp that label and use it as kind of a disguise or. So I think it's one reason I don't like the socialist label if what somebody's advocating for is largely liberal or works in a liberal or capitalist framework. I think that there are huge moral and democratic questions about what the expropriation of property ultimately looks like. A lot of the examples I think that Econoboy gives for how we could expropriate property, I think, are a little bit unsatisfactory. So when we bring up things like civil asset forfeiture or things like eminent domain, like we're not taking these things to socialize them or to make them like a part of a socialist economy. Usually they're done for other reasons, sometimes for punishments for crimes or sometimes for necessary government projects. I don't think that those comparisons are the same as trying to acquire 90 to 100% of the overall capital of the United States, under the ownership of the government. I think that when we talk about egalitarianism and when we talk about idealized forms of economies, I don't know how much time I'll argue this, but I think it's interesting that you always hear this argument, and even capitalists give here, arguments will, socialists will say, and capitalists will say, well, socialism only works in an idealized form of society where there's no human greed. And in an ideal world, maybe we'd be socialist. But I don't actually know why that's true. I feel like people assume that, and it's not necessarily the case. Like, I can envision an ideal socialist world where everybody shares in the means of production and we all get the fruits of our own labor and, we all can do that, sure. But I could also conceive of an ideal capitalist world where everybody has really high-paying jobs. They can choose who they want to work for at any point in time and quit and leave. And, I feel like you could have idealized versions versions of both worlds. It's just difficult because with capitalism, there's a real world implementation of that, and you have to fight on that real world implementation. And then on the socialist version, you have to fight on the kind of like idealized or utopian version. So it's harder to kind of like point out flaws. 4 and 5, I think for the fourth point, I've got socializing profits is a thing that socialists always talk about. Like we want equal ownership in the means of production so that we can all kind of reap the rewards. And I think that's an attractive quality about sharing in the ownership of the means of production. But it also means socializing decisions. And I feel like there's not as much time paid to the socializing decisions parts. So for instance, if the government owns 90 to 100% of all the capital in the country, that means that every new business started kind of has to be started by the government. So are we taking votes on that? Are they going to be picking winners and losers? Are they going to decide, whether or not there's an 18 or older ID verification limit on my pornographic consumption, or whether or not League of Legends gets canceled for Dota 2 or whatever else? And then I think that for the final thing, this is kind of a general complaint I've had. When people talk about like, we got these really good things because of socialism in the United States, whether you're talking minimum wage or 40-hour work weeks or whatever else, I think it's important to clarify that all of these things are happening in a liberal system, and there are good things that can happen from lots of different modes of economic production and lots of different countries that can happen in a liberal capitalist system. But if we were to move to a fully socialist system, we could only do the good socialist things. You wouldn't have any of the good capitalist things, and I think that is problematic.
Okay. Is that your goal, Econoboy, to move to a entirely socialist system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's moral reasons to think that the socialist ideal of complete social ownership of businesses would be a good thing, right? That, again, if we could, and this is something that I've said before, I think a kind of a typical argument that people will make against socialism is, oh, well, it looks great on paper, which is to say, like, intuitively, sure, like a totally egalitarian system looks great, but it just doesn't work, right? We just can't make it work for one reason or another. And I would say that, look, I mean, I guess I don't know, as we move through the process of like fully socializing the economy, exactly what it would look like when we start to get to 80, 85, 90% of businesses being collectively owned. But I think that there's strong reason to believe that we can at least get a great majority of the way there without these kind of huge deleterious effects on the economy. And at the end of the day, I'm not super stubborn about this. Like if we get to whatever, 75%, like we've replaced institutional private investors with institutional public investors, which is to say about 75% of the stock market and all this kind of stuff is owned publicly instead of privately. And all of a sudden, we have this kind of like radically egalitarian system compared to what we had before with similar standards of living. I guess I'm just not so offended by that, right? But in our current system where we have just such a high level of inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality, and what I think to be pretty obvious solutions towards fixing that problem in pretty direct ways, and we can look at other examples of countries that have done that, we should certainly do it, because I think that most people have at the very least egalitarian instincts, and so we should move toward that direction, even if once we get there, it's like, we have to kind of make some sticky decisions on the edge. I think that the bigger discussion is, should we move towards that direction, and what does moving towards that direction look like? Because certainly I think that we should, and certainly I think that there's a good way to move towards that direction.
Can I ask a question on this? I'm trying to hone in when you say moral reasons, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding is if you had a fully socialist society where all of the workers are owning all of their means of productions, that would basically do little, if anything, to address overall wealth inequality. No? Wouldn't you still have massive wealth inequality across different firms, even if not within different firms? So for instance, if there was like a cooperatively owned or socialist owned engineering firm, wouldn't all those people make way more money than the cooperatively owned janitorial cleaning services firm?
Yeah. So I think it's important to maybe take a step back. So there's a lot of different ways to collectively own the means of production. Worker ownership is just one of those ways. Now, I don't really favor a worker ownership model personally. I tend to favor social ownership models through things like expansion of government services, which probably you and I would agree that some government services should be expanded, like public transit, healthcare systems, things like that. And then I think that the bulk of the market economy should be owned by these kind of publicly owned holding corporations and sovereign wealth funds, which compete against each other similar to how current asset managers already do. And that would create a hugely egalitarian distribution because public wealth is sort of necessarily horizontally distributed because the way that that wealth is managed is one person, one vote, not necessarily one worker in one cooperative, one vote. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, so then so we're saying that the businesses are collectively owned, meaning that so employees could still like quit and go to other jobs or get education and training, go to other jobs. Does this mean that the government then would be basically collecting the excess in worker, like in the value produced by the worker? The government would basically be the stand-in for the capital owner there?
Well, I mean, even Marx in his Critique of the Gotha program said that the worker is not entitled to the entire surplus value that they create, that you need money to be set aside for things like administration, welfare payments, and I think he also said like essentially capital rotation, like reinvestments in capital, right? And so similarly, right, by having a social ownership model, we're essentially accomplishing all of those goals at once, where the worker is returned a substantial portion of the value that they create, because obviously workers still enjoy the fruits of the government's services and welfare payments and, UBI or whatever we use the capital income for. But it also goes to those other things that Marx identified as important as well, just general welfare payments for people who can't work. I think he identified the elderly and people like that as well. And of course, the government can also make public investments with that money as well.
Okay, so I'm trying to just understand. So like administration fees, I wouldn't consider this like capital owner, right? So when I think of capital, I think of for a business, you are deploying you're deploying your capital, and then you're deploying your labor. And then when the labor interacts with the capital, the labor is creating some value. And then when that product is like sold to some consumer, some money goes back to the cost of the business, but there's an excess at the top after administrative fees, after everything else. And that excess at the top would go to the capital investor. And I'm just trying to understand. So in this state, you would have the capital investor, the capital owner. The owner class is just replaced by the state, right?
Yeah, the capital owners would be the public at large, right? So again, I think that Marx, obviously, a lot of in Marx's writings, he's a little bit vague. Obviously, he recommended, at some points in his life, he recommended state ownership, but it seemed like there was a cooperative ownership model maybe in the mature part of his life. At the end of the day, though, I'm just saying that, number one, I don't think that Marx is like a definitive view of what socialism is, but even to the extent that he is, I think that the spirit of this, where the worker receives a great portion of the value that they create, but set aside for the rest of society things like administrative expenses, capital investment, and welfare payments, I think that the spirit of that is accomplished with a social ownership model as well. And of course, to the extent that maybe some Marx historian would just say, no, Conable, you're totally wrong and misinterpreting Marx, it's like, well, whatever, my system's much more egalitarian, so that's why I prefer it.
Sure. So I'm not trying to figure out what Marx. I'm just trying for your personal, just so that we can understand. I guess what I guess you would advocate for personally. So so then we're saying that okay. So just going back so I understand. Well, I don't know if Marx agrees or disagrees, but okay. You're replacing the capital owner of the business with the state, essentially, with the government, right?
Yeah, ultimately the state would be the owner of the shares in some complex system, but it's managed through these kind of holding corporations and sovereign wealth funds.
Okay. So the state has ownership, and then the management. Does the state like? You don't have to be like hyper specific here, but I was trying to understand what the managing structure, I guess, would look like. So it's not the state making the decisions; it's the holding companies, or.
Yeah, so I think that these things should be kind of technocratically managed. You mentioned that people should really focus on that kind of decision-making process, and that was a large part of what the third part of my Substack was about. Is like, how do these capital allocation decisions get made, as inspired by this book that I read, The Public Wealth of Nations. And so essentially what I would recommend is that the way that the public should manage its wealth is it should be in these competing holding corporations, which are capitalized initially by the state in one way or another, however the state gets its money to capitalize the funds. These funds would then be managed by professional investment managers, kind of at arm's length from the state. You can think of it sort of like the Federal Reserve, right? Where the Federal Reserve is kind of this like quasi-independent private agency type situation, but it's more technocratically managed. Do that same kind of similar structure, but with all these different competing holding corporations that operate independently from each other, but are ultimately owned by the state. And then as they allocate that capital and the returns from that capital kind of trickle up to them, they would dividend out part of that to the state directly, and then they would use part of that to reinvest in other businesses and other entrepreneurial activity, similar to how private asset managers do today.
the how are they initially capitalized by the state? Like, how would a state decide? Like, oh, like there's 5 firms that do stuff. I guess. Yeah. How does that?
I recommend a path in the same Substack that I referenced. So there's 3 main ways. So number 1 is the state already owns, unbeknownst to it, a lot of public wealth. Dag Detter in the Public Wealth of Nations book, he estimates that basically because the state just has really poor system of accounting, the state already owns about 1 times GDP worth of public assets. They just don't account for them properly. And so what a lot of states have done, both in relation to Dag Detter's work, but then in opposite to that, is they've just accounted for their current public assets and spun them off into these holding corporations to be managed entrepreneurially. The state just realizes, oh, we own a lot of real estate. Oh, we have all these SOEs that we don't really account for properly. We have all these kind of like state, kind of quasi-state service companies that we run. Let's put those into a commercial bucket, holding corporation. Professional investment managers allocate that capital, run it professionally. So that's one way. Another way is that the central bank...
First thing, having wealth. So wealth, broadly speaking, can include things like capital. You can't invest like capital. If we're not talking money, like just because you might have like a state ownership of a bunch of utility companies or power plants, doesn't mean you can just invest that, because that's represented by like physical capital, not like just money.
Yeah,
right?
It's a mixture of things, right? So it's physical capital. The public at large, the most poorly accounted for assets in a public portfolio are typically real estate assets. Municipal buildings, rights of way, public lands, things like that. And so what you would do is you'd put all that capital into a single portfolio. This would be worth about $29 trillion. Some of those assets, like you said, wouldn't be commercial. They'd be like state parks or, municipal buildings that are currently in use. It's like, wouldn't be commercial. They'd be like currently in use. But for all the towards an entrepreneurial use, let's say that it's half the $29 trillion, 13 and a half, or what would that be, 15 or 14 and a half trillion dollars, then you could take all of that. Oh, Wick, is everything okay?
No, yeah, you froze for a minute, and we were like, did I lose?
You can take all of those real estate assets and then say, okay, well, let's just start developing them, right? And so part of that could be real estate development. It could be selling that off and investing in equities, just kind of generally building the wealth of society. That's just one way. The other two ways are...
Okay, wait, I'm trying to understand this for the first thing, because I'm super confused. Okay. So it sounded like we were saying, so I'm trying to figure out, like, how do you capitalize these initial public holding corporations? So, like, where do they get their money from initially? And then it sounded like the answer was, well, there is actually a whole bunch of wealth that exists in the United States that's actually not accounted for right now, which I agree is actually a weird problem. We talk about GDP, but we don't actually know the nation's wealth. Like, what is the total public accounting of all the assets? And then you say, well, there's a lot of these things that exist out there that aren't accounted for very well, and so we could have a better accounting of them. It's like, okay, but when we have that better accounting of them, we're not talking about money sitting in bank accounts. We're talking about we're like the stuff that capital is allocated to, that it buys. So like power plants or real estate or whatever. So just to simply answer
your question, they would be sold for money, or they would be developed directly, right? So you
how would they sell it? But if we're talking about a model where we're moving to public ownership of all these things, who are you selling it to?
Well, I mean, you have to transition from one system to another through some deliberative process, right? So currently they would be sold to like a bunch of different, private investors or other like state investors who would want to invest in those. Like, oh, we want to buy this real estate, we'll exchange it for cash. And then the holding corporation can take that cash and then do other development activities, invest it in public equities, just do entrepreneurial investing and, balance sheet management, just like any of these other asset managers do. And then through that process, they would accumulate capital.
The examples that we're giving here, can you give me a couple examples of things that seems like a horrible idea. Hold on, I'm sorry. Like, I'm thinking like the things that the public owns to be like, are we selling national parks for cash to capitalize our new public holding firms? Or are we selling like Section 8 housing, or are we selling power plants?
I just said there are going to be some assets that are not commercial in nature. I even referenced national parks. Like, you probably wouldn't, you wouldn't sell a national park for cash, but there's a lot of just empty land or abandoned buildings that the government owns that it doesn't use productively because the government just has a very poor system of accounting for those assets, right? And so to the extent that we have assets like that we think like, we're not using this basically for any productive purpose, we can either lease those out for development directly to strip back cash from the market and use for other entrepreneurial activities, or we could, which is to say directly develop them, or we could just sell those for cash and then use the cash, these kind of socialized rents, for other entrepreneurial activity, investing in equities, private equity investment, whatever it ends up being. And through that process, the state now is, either developing assets directly, or it transfers assets for cash and uses the cash for development activities.
Okay, I understand the answer. I think it's very unsatisfactory, but okay, I got part one, and then you had two more other points.
Right.
Yeah.
So the other two ways that the state could capitalize these funds, number one is just through efficient tax revenue, right? So you just take tax money and capitalize funds. Oh, this we're gonna dedicate a certain amount of tax revenue to a sovereign wealth fund every year, and then once the sovereign wealth fund accumulates enough capital, we're gonna split it off into these different holding corporations. You could certainly do it that way. Another way, that the last thing that I'll say, which I think is kind of an interesting way to think about, the Bank of Japan does something a little bit similar, is that the Federal Reserve engages in quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve creates money and then transfers that cash that they created with financial assets. But our Federal Reserve has the restriction where they only use that cash to buy fixed income. They don't buy equities with that. And so what we could do is engage in the same countercyclical policy that we already engage in. And instead of just buying debt instruments, we could buy equities as well. And through that process, we could accumulate capital and then transfer that capital into a sovereign wealth fund, and then eventually split it off into competing holding corporations once the sovereign wealth fund gets big enough. That way.
And then
so those are three main ways.
So I understand we have a couple of ways that we would get the money there. How do you make the decision of like how many of these holding companies will you have, and who gets, like, how do you do that part?
Yeah, I think in terms of the decision making on how you would do it, I think you would want to have as rules based a system as possible. Currently, I don't know that I would have any strict upper limits on like how big a holding corporation could be. I think that once you would say like, oh, the sovereign wealth fund accumulated $15 trillion and we're going to spin it off into like 15 different $1 trillion holding corporations as like an initial portfolio, you could do something like that. But I think that it's important to note that like currently asset allocation is highly concentrated. I mean, I think the top two asset managers in the country control something like 15 or $20 trillion worth of wealth just in and of themselves. And so the holding corporations that do the best are going to accumulate the most capital and make the most returns.
These are assets under management. They're not assets controlled directly by the holding companies, number one, which I think is significantly different because individuals still have the ability to allocate their portfolios the way that they see fit. And then two, these people, the assets under management, these large firms are not owning the things like wholesale that they are managing assets for, right? Like it's not like BlackRock or any of these huge assets under management firms are like making decisions for all of these companies unilaterally, kind of like our public holding corporations would be. So I feel like these are meaningfully different in those two ways.
Yeah, it's not meaningfully different. What I advocate for is a couple of different structures. So on the first point of, it's different because...
Wait, real quick, Just in terms of the meaningfully different, it's different to say that somebody has 10% ownership of a stock in a company versus somebody has like a controlling share that's making all the decisions for the company, right?
Right, but I don't necessarily advocate for holding corporations always buying controlling interest in companies, right? That's what I was going to explain. So, these holding corporations, again, my goal is that these holding corporations would have similar mandates to current asset managers, which is to say that they would have, some basic kind of return threshold. They would need to actively manage the funds, and that once they distribute those funds, they need to balance it on a risk-adjusted basis. They need to have like essentially a risk-weighted portfolio. Which means that typically speaking, you wouldn't just go out and buy like a majority of Amazon stock. You might buy 2% of Amazon stock and 1% of Apple and 1% of Walmart. You'd have a highly distributed portfolio of assets, and maybe you do a little bit of private equity investing or venture capital on the side. And to the first point that you made, you made one because yeah, sure.
Hey, go ahead, Destiny, please.
Okay, so that we stay kind of in one area, because there are things that I think would be super based, like having some kind of basically a public dividend for large companies in the United States that is returned to like every American citizen. I think is an amazing idea because it gives all of us a feeling of accomplishment and investment and like return when our companies do well. Like if Facebook or Amazon or somebody posts huge earnings, the average American doesn't give a fuck unless you have stock in it, right? And I think having some ownership there is great, but we're not talking about just these funds that are broadly diversified and invested in the economy, because this just sounds like kind of an extravagant like IRA or 401k basically. And I think that's meaningfully different than I think we were kind of talking about like controlling shares for these companies, no?
Well, it's so the controlling shares would be that the public would own the holding corporation, right? But we're talking about the holding corporations, which would independently manage the accumulated wealth of the public. So it's a matter of like, what do the holding corporations actually own? And so let's just imagine we get to like my ideal end state. We've got like 100 different of these holding corporations, right? And they've kind of like eaten up, BlackRock is literally like a publicly owned company at this point, right? They've kind of eaten up all of those other.
Well, BlackRock is not even close to publicly owned, right? But
BlackRock is publicly owned, but it's a publicly traded company. I'm just using that as a quick aside. But
you were saying if they were public, I understand. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. When we say holding corporations, what I'm trying to figure out is like, how did these get created? Like, let's say that there are two holding corporations in my state, and one is called like Green Energy Forever, and the other one is called like Veganism Rules. And I really want to invest in companies. I would prefer my money would go to the coal-fired dog-eating factory people or whatever, right? How does like a new holding corporation get created that would allocate money in a way that I would want to see my public money go towards? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Like, how do you create those new holding corporations? You've talked about how you would capitalize them. I'm curious who would decide how to make them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in terms of who would decide how to make them, I mean, that, like I said, I mean, I think that would be a rules-based process. You'd probably have some kind of superstructure for, some basic rules that you would establish for managing the whole portfolio of holding corporations, where they would decide, okay, like what are the basic guidances we want to give to these holding corporations? What are the kind of like transparency requirements that we would have? And then similar to your point, like, okay, well, this is how we would determine when to spin off new holding corporations with the accumulations from either tax revenue, other public assets, or the sovereign wealth fund, right? So it would be
the only reason I'm focusing on this part so hard is because in my opinion, one of the best advantages of capitalism, if you want to be a capitalist cuck, which I am, is that capital can respond efficiently and quickly and robustly to huge economic problems. I think when people argue, there was some paper, I think it was on working paper on IBER or whatever, that said that like no liberal economy in the history of the planet has had a massive famine or whatever. And I think part of the argument was that not only is the media able to report on things quickly, but capital can shift very quickly around to different sections of the economy to respond and adapt to different things. So one of the advantages of capital is that people can identify market signals, put money in an area and invest in something, and then do whatever they want there. But when we talk about these holding corporations, we're talking about removing that decision-making apparatus and somehow making it a government thing. And I'm trying to figure out like how are these things made? And if to gloss over this and then to move on to the rest of the stuff, this is like the hard stuff that I would argue that if capitalism does anything well, it's this is allocating capital. Yeah.
Well, right. So there's a number of ways where I think that concern is kind of misplaced. So number one, if we look at how capital is actually invested in current society, and there's a lot of papers on this, is most kind of liquid capital that's invested is passively invested, right? It's like people that aren't even making any sort of an active decision with how they're investing their capital, right? So in some sense, you could say by transitioning a great bulk of that market, if we just were to like neutrally buy assets, so for every one asset that we buy that's actively managed, another one's passively managed. And economists have said that this passive investment is kind of a problem for the allocative process. We're kind of transitioning to a more actively managed market in the first place. So I think that there's some allocative. Sure.
I don't know if I agree with that. That most capital that is allocated today is allocated passively.
The liquid capital, right? So these are most of the assets that are managed by these institutional investors, like the overwhelming portfolio.
What do we mean when we say passively managed?
So when you what passive management is, right? So like passive management is when you would just invest money that essentially just tracks an index on behalf of, it's essentially managed by the asset holding corporation, right? It's not really something that you're going out and sort of trying to find, the actual good investments out there. You're just kind of free riding off of all of the other allocations that are happening actively.
Sure. So I feel like we can call it passive management, but isn't that kind of like one layer removed? Because the funds that you're tracking are index funds that are kind of being managed by people that are, trying to pick like a good assortment of funds within a particular index, and then the index itself can change based on market capitalization of companies. And it is like passively managed in the same way that like if I give money to an ice cream maker, I'm like passively giving that money, and I'm not actually making my ice cream, but a guy that's getting the money is actively making the ice cream, right?
Well, there's a lot of papers on how this is like an allocative distortion, right? Because when essentially it makes it to where there's not as much actual entrepreneurial investing activity, and you're increasing the risk of improper allocation of capital because you're sort of necessarily lowering the amount of actual active investing that people are doing when they're going out and trying to search for the best investments. And so the holding corporations, by engaging in an active management process, are kind of effectively solving that problem by some great proportion, and ideally leading to better allocative efficiency. Because again, I do advocate for very strict technocratic management of these assets. In general. And so to your point, just the last thing, just one more thing. The last thing that I haven't been able to say is that you keep on saying that the decision-making process of capital moving in certain places when they see market activity, again, like that whole competitive process between these asset managers is still internalized into my system, that these big asset managers that are now publicly owned would have the same competitive dynamics and incentives to do the exact same thing under my system as they do under our current system. They'd have the profit motive, market dynamics, liquid markets.
Well, this is the thing that I don't understand. That's why I keep asking how these are created, because I don't think they would have that same I don't know how they would have that same incentive. Like if there are 5 holding corporations, I still don't know how you pick 5 or how 5 are created. So if one underperforms, do you eliminate it? Now there are 4, or do you spin up a new one? Or
yeah, Destiny, I feel like I've already answered this. So okay, so I guess to answer your question.
Let me ask this very clearly. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay,
because I feel like you haven't answered this at all, and it keeps getting spoke around. I don't know if it's intentional. Okay. All right. So let's say that. Okay, so let's say that we are we are restructuring our economy in a way that we want to have these public holding corporations. Okay, so what we do is we have the government that has like a big bucket of money, and the government is going to allocate its money to these private holding, or not private, it's going to allocate money to these holding corporations, and then they're going to basically serve as all of these massive asset managers like BlackRock is. You're creating BlackRocks basically that the government is giving money to for the initial capitalization, and then they're going to be investing in individual firms, and then their metrics are going to be tracked by profit and all that. What I'm asking is, where do those initial holding companies come from? How do you create those initial holding companies? Like if there are 2 or 10, what is the difference? Yeah.
Okay, so the 3 different ways that I described, you have tax money, you have essentially quantitative easing, you have the public assets.
You're talking about how you capitalize it. I'm talking about how you create them. How do you create them?
You get to vote on them. Like, so if I wanted a puppy killing holding corporation and Destiny wanted a Discord DM privacy lock safe guarantee holding corporation.
Okay,
it's like,
so the way
to vote on those?
Yeah, so I've already
Would I vote on those? Is what?
Okay. So I've advocated for this, and I'll say again, I'll try to say it more clearly, for a rules-based kind of superstructure process for doing that. So what do I mean by that? Okay. For instance, right, the Federal Reserve, we have like the Board of Governors, and different presidents kind of appoint the Board of Governors, right?
No. Federal Reserve has 2 mandates that aren't tied to like the profit motive or.
I'm just using that as an example, Destiny. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, right? So for instance,
I know you're not saying it's the same. I'm saying it's disanalogous because you only have one Federal Reserve. We're not talking about creating multiple Federal Reserves, and their goal isn't to make money or pick winners or losers. That's why I call it a superstructure,
right? So again, you might have a superstructure. So all the different holding corporations would have their own boards that are appointed, right, by the public, by this kind of rules-based process. But then you might have a superstructure that says, okay, like this is the general guidance we would give the firms. This is how much wealth we've accumulated in our financial assets from our sovereign wealth fund. Hey, we think it's time now to vote on whether or not to open a new public holding corporation because, we've got $5 trillion in our sovereign wealth fund. Let's do another $1 trillion like holding corporation and recapitalize it, similar to this kind of broad superstructure of competing holding corporations that we have. So I just that's a completely direct answer to that question. I think there'd probably be some kind of superstructure, rules-based, independent technocratic management process for determining how to capitalize new holding corporations. To answer the other question you asked about what happens to firms that fail, the same thing that happens to firms that fail today, right? Like I believe in hard budget constraints. Once they're capitalized, you're on your own. You got to compete in the market. You have to survive. You have to do what you got to do to basically, earn a living, right? And if these holding corporations were to go bankrupt, then they have to go through the ordinary bankrupt process. The goal of any portfolio is, and this is for the audience because I'm sure you understand this, is that the goal for any portfolio is not for every single investment that you make to succeed at all times. It's just to have a weighted, risk-adjusted portfolio so that you're not overly exposed to any one thing, to the extent that where if one holding corporation or one investment within a holding corporation goes bust, you have enough of a diversified investment pool that you're still getting a lot of returns for the public, a lot of returns from your portfolio at large.
Okay, and then I guess I just want to let the record reflect I am not happy with the superstructure answer, but I accept it. I'll move on to the next thing. I'm just curious, how do these holding corporations, how do they engage with I don't know what we would call these firms. Are they private firms? Like would an individual go to a holding corporation and say, I want to start a business that manages electricians, and then the firm might invest in that business? or the holding company might invest in that firm, or like what does the ownership structure of these individual firms look like that the holding companies invest in?
Yeah. So they would start out, and I think throughout the process of transition until we get to total socialization, the process would look very similar to what it looks like now, where people would be able to just go out and start businesses and decide the ownership structure for however they wanted. I think that where the holding corporations would come in that process.
Wait. You keep glossing. People can't start businesses in your model though, because the capital is all managed by the holding corporations, right?
Well, no, because again, there's a huge transitionary period where there's still a huge amount of privately owned capital.
Ignore the transitionary period, and let's say that we're past it into your kind of more towards much closer to your ideal model. It's not individuals starting businesses; it has to be the holding companies, right?
Yeah. So if individuals in an ideal system, right? So again, I do think that in like complete social ownership, there's, as Matt Brunig told you in your conversation with him, there's like genuinely sticky issues as to like how exactly would you socialize the whole entire economy. I can tell you what I would maybe imagine would happen. So number one, I think that you'd probably still allow for some amount of retail investing, because if you're just like a sole proprietor, I don't think most socialists have huge problems with like sole proprietorships if you just want to go and trade stock. So you'd still have that quarter of the market that's kind of like retail invested. And then other than that, what you would do to start a business is you would probably go to the holding corporations, you go to banks.
Hold on, I don't understand that. When sole proprietorship has retail investing, I don't know what these things have to do with each other. If I want to hire employees, that would basically be disallowed in your system, wouldn't it be?
Well, retail, I mean, if you're a retail investor, I mean, typically, I think when we talk about like retail investing, we're talking about just individuals just trading stock.
I understand.
Right?
I understand retail investors versus institutional investors. I'm not talking about the investment part. I'm talking about the firms themselves and the ownership structure. I can't, in your idealized version, I can't walk out and hire employees to start a business, right?
Yeah. So in a total idealized system, which again I have a hard time imagining, I think that we can get to like 75% social ownership, and then again these genuinely sticky issues come up, which I think are very relevant criticisms to point out. But I can tell you kind of what I would roughly imagine. I think that if you were going to go out and start a business, you'd probably have to engage in the state in some way. Like you'd have to sell like a portion of your equity over time, or maybe you could go out and try to raise funds from other retail investors that would be able to offer you some amount of money, or maybe you'd have to rely on lending in some sort. Something like that. But I think that once you try to go for like a very, very rigid model, it becomes very, very hard to kind of imagine what that process would look like, at least to me.
Okay. Well, I'm unsatisfied with that answer, but I will accept it. Okay.
Look, I guess, yeah, I'm unsatisfied too. You keep switching, Econoboy, and I don't mean to double team you here, right? But you keep switching between, well, there's a transitionary period where the rules would be X, but then I want Y where the rules would be something else.
Well, right. So, I mean, we could
rather talk about, I think what
so again,
might be
let me just answer the question. Yeah, just let me answer the question directly. Okay, I'll imagine an ideal end state, right? So what we might imagine is that you still have about, what we have now. We have like 25% retail investors. They're still just doing their little individual investing. I don't think that my socialism, I guess, I don't really care if people individually go out and invest money if they want. Now, other than that, it's like, okay, well, how do you start a business? Well, I guess that entire process could be socialized within the holding corporations themselves, where it would basically be these holding corporations deciding what to invest in and why, and they would be competing against each other to do the exact same thing. Now, if an individual, like you guys are describing, like, hey, an individual wants to go out and start a business, well, I guess you'd have to basically go to the holding corporations and convince them to capitalize.
Basically.
Yeah, you have to convince.
Like it's a stand-in for government.
Well, it's independently managed from the government, but ultimately the public would be the shareholders, right? So yeah, you'd have to go
appoints them. The government gets to decide who's on these holding corporations, etc.
Well, yeah, but Wick, there's a huge difference between you got to go to a government bureaucrat and you have to go to a technocratically managed asset manager, right? Like it's like the difference between
the government.
So, well, it's an independent agency, right? So ideally, it wouldn't be like strictly beholden to like any one government, right? It would have its sort of independent rules-based system that it follows. Now, obviously, the government can, around the edges, I think, make some reforms if they want. I mean, we do have a democracy after all. It wouldn't be like a 100% independent thing. But yeah, if you wanted to start a business, you basically have to go to the holding corporation and convince them to capitalize that business and invest in it. Similar to how people have to go to asset managers today. The only difference, well, I guess not to minimize it, but the only difference would be that would be essentially like your only option. You'd have to go to either a bank or one of these holding corporations, or you'd have to be a retail investor just doing the same thing.
Okay.
Right.
Wonderful.
And in a
Why
system
is-
like that, I think that I think there's a good reason to think that even in that kind of idealist version of our system, we would have great levels of equality. We'd get trillions of dollars of dividend payments to, use for public purposes that we wanted. And I think that the allocation process fundamentally would be very sound because, again, the allocation process looks extremely similar to the allocation process that we have today under our current kind of asset managers. And lastly, what I would argue is that, look, I think that a more egalitarian system in many ways is substantially more entrepreneurial than our current system, right? A lot of these billionaires who talk about how they started their businesses, they don't say, oh, I got $10 billion from my dad, and that's how I started my $10 billion factory, right? It's like, oh, I started in a garage. I got, Trump says I got a small loan of $1 million. Well, obviously, if we horizontalize a lot of that capital and have this much greater equality of opportunity, then ideally there'd be a lot more people that are able to actually live up to their full capabilities in my system versus the current system that we have now.
Okay, I guess a couple questions for both of you in this point, right? So to Destiny first, I guess. What in principle, okay, is the difference about democratically voting to raise taxes and democratically voting for other forms of expropriation? What's this word?
Expropriation.
Thank you. For property, like what's the difference between this? So, for example, what in principle allows you to compel a company to turn over a percentage of its profits versus more like what Econoboy is talking about, where the government compels you to work through these holding companies to do your business?
I think, was this a dono?
No, this is just a question I have.
Oh, there's some guy in my chat that spent this question 50 trillion fucking times. I think expropriation is meaningfully different than taxes, because I feel like when people talk about expropriation, you're typically talking about taking like a thing that the person will no longer have access to. Usually you're talking about a form of like a thing, like an actual physical, like a building or something else. You're taking that. Taxes are generally like surplus thing, like they're applied to profits. It's not like you're taxing my revenues and I don't even have money to pay my bills and the government's coming after something and now they're going to take my property, my buildings or whatever. So generally taxes are applied to profits. So excesses, money, things that are like fungible, and expropriation is usually tied to things that are not fungible and it's like taking an irreplaceable thing from you. I think they're meaningfully different things.
Okay, fair enough. To you, Econoboy, is there such a thing? And if there is, can you kind of walk me through it? A liberal socialism. Like, how is liberalism in your mind compatible with the economic model you just kind of laid out there?
Yeah, sure. Number one, I do want to challenge, Destiny and also Uwick, because I'm not hearing much in terms of concrete reasons why my model would be like deeply allocatively inefficient.
Very vague.
Wick, there's nothing vague about what I'm saying. I'm saying we have all these asset managers now. Just imagine a system where they're all public instead of privately owned. Okay, imagine that, right? Like that's the complete. And if you just literally don't understand how capital is allocated in our system, and so you have no conception of what that looks like, just say that, Wick. But don't say I'm not being specific. Goddammit. Sorry, I got a little triggered.
Well, so the thing,
and
it doesn't make sense.
Sure, I'll answer the viewer's question after you respond, Destiny. Sorry.
Or go ahead. You can answer the question.
But yeah, anyway, so I do actually want to learn, like, I hear a lot of, it just seems like it doesn't, I want to, get into that. Tell me why. So on the answer of, can you have a liberal socialism? So yes, I think that for the most part, I think liberalism is defined by individual rights, political equality, things like that. I don't think liberalism is necessarily defined by, in large majority part, the ability to start a private business. I think there's a reason why, famous kind of historical liberal J.S. Mill, he endorsed socialism at the end of his life, even though he was a very committed liberal for his time, and obviously had an incomplete view of liberalism himself. But even like contemporary liberalism, probably the most famous liberal thinker contemporarily is John Rawls. And Rawls also endorsed socialism, right? Rawls said that you can certainly achieve liberal ideals with a democratic socialist system. And he thought that because, again, the things about political equality and individual rights, like there's nothing necessarily incompatible with socialism and the idea of having essentially political equality and individual rights, right? Like, I don't think my system would abolish free speech. I don't think my system would not be democratic in nature. I've already said, hey, if people just like don't want to do what I'm suggesting, well, vote against it. I don't know. I'm not going to fucking force anybody to do anything. So anyway, so that's kind of what I'm describing ultimately.
Okay, you had something to say, Destiny, to him, and we can kind of go through that.
Yeah. So so I feel like the challenge is that you say that you're answering questions, but every time you answer the question, we package all of the really difficult things into this like phrase of like an ambiguous superstructure or like the rules or some crazy rule set, and it's like, okay.
We still here? Hello?
What just happened? We beeped for a second.
Okay. Did it not? Okay. I'm gonna start over. It feels like the issue is every time I try to like figure out how like any of these things are. Wait, is it working? Hello?
No, it is.
I'm here. Yeah. You guys are here.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like we get like the answer is like, oh, well, there would be rules to take care of that. And it's like those rules I think are pretty important. It also seems like we're at the end of the day, when we start to drill it down into this, all we've done is we've basically created capitalism with like a different tax structure. So for instance, I'm very confused. You're advocating for a system of socialism where individuals can still start firms on their own and then scrape excesses from the surplus value created by their employees. That's a very strange. The only difference is we're just the initial investment comes from holding corporations that are capitalized with public funds. Is that the answer? Is that like, if I wanted to start a business, am I allowed to hire employees?
Okay, so I feel like, okay, so originally it's like, well, accountability, I'm not going to make you just completely, totally lay out a 500-page document of how exactly this works. And so what I answered to your question was, let's just imagine that it's a committee superstructure where, hey, we've accumulated $10 trillion of a sovereign wealth fund. We're going to take $1 trillion of that and do one new holding corporation that now has to go out and invest. I think that Wick is pretty specific on how the holding corporations get formed.
Wait, nothing that you just said there had anything to do with my question.
You asked how they get formed, and I just answered.
No, I asked, you can hire employees. Can you hire employees? Are you allowed to do that?
So if the new question is not how do you fund or do the holding corporations, but can you hire employees? I'll answer that
directly.
Just to be
clear, before you said that, we can go back in the video. My question was literally just, are you allowed to hire employees? That was my question.
Okay, Destiny, are you claiming you didn't ask me 100 times how do the new holding corporations get formed? Though that wasn't a question that was a mainstay that you've asked? I mean, really? Like, come on. You asked that like 5 or 10 times, and I feel like we've kind of been circling the drain on that.
Give me 1 second. Hold on.
All right, give me a second. Go for it. And by the way, you asked about if you can hire employees, and I said no. You'd have to interact with the public holding corporations to do that. And I feel like that's pretty specific. I don't know, guys. Like, I just get to choose not answering questions when I give a no as an answer. You know? You have to.
I'm thinking he's going back to find the clip of it, but he asked you.
No, find the clip.
And then when you went on about a 500-page document and.
Wick, no, that was literally just now, Wick. He asked, okay, well, what would you do? How would you hire employees? And I said, well, you'd probably have retail investors that were just individual sole proprietors that don't hire employees. To the extent that you wanted to hire... Okay, so...
I'm just asking, like, how can you... I'm asking if you can hire employees. That was my question.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to... If any of you dicks say, I'm not answering this question directly, I'm going to kill myself on stream in a video game, okay? So, can you hire employees in my ideal system? The answer is no. You would have to go to the capital owners, which are the public in this case, and get them to capitalize your business, and you'd have to have a shared ownership structure. I've said that before,
wait. Just
and
to
I'm
be clear,
saying that
You're
again.
not saying you'd go to the public. You would go to the holding corporations that are
the
ran by
holding
technocrats.
corporations. I'm just saying the public because Wick gets triggered. Oh, it's actually the state. It's actually the government. Yes, it's the public holding corporations.
Because you're saying that the holding corporations would be competing against each other, so you kind of solve for your market inefficiencies there by just calling it the government. So I'm trying to be more charitable.
Okay, no, you're being more charitable. Wick is being the fucking dumbass in this conversation. Sorry, Wick, I love you, but Jesus Christ. Okay.
It's okay to call me a dumbass. Everyone goes after the ref. Okay.
That's true. That's true.
I'm just trying to figure out as an individual right now, if I want to start a business, okay, I can hire employees and get initial capital to pay them and sell products and stuff, right? That's how we do business. But in your world, so I would have to, like, I'm just trying to figure, I don't even know what the process would look like of getting employees or because I can't start a business on my own. what would it even mean to start a business? Are you even allowed
Well,
to
you
start a
would-
business? Or would it just be me and 5 other people who would say,
Well,
we all want to be plumbers? Can
yeah,
somebody
I
else
mean,
make a business?
again, this is the ideal system, and which is, I think, to me a little bit harder to imagine. But yeah, in the ideal system, I think you'd essentially be like the leader of the organization. You'd be like the CEO, and not necessarily the sole owner of the business. And I think that that's the main difference. But you'd go in and you'd convince the public holding corporation, hey, like for instance, I'm an engineer who worked in the oil field services industry for 10 years. I think I could start an oil field service businesses. Here's my kind of like my business plan. I think that this is the salary I deserve because I'm the CEO. And the public holding corporation would say, you know what, that sounds like a good idea. Here's $10 million. Go out and make a bunch of money. And, here's some performance pay or whatever. It'd be a very similar system. Again, it's just that the ownership structure would be public instead of private. And that's a very specific example. I hope that is a fucking really concrete, just the oil field services example. That's pretty concrete, if you ask me, in terms of imagining what it would look like.
Gotcha. Okay. So then for compensation, how are we getting to our more kind of like egalitarian world if the guy is being compensated like so much more as like the owner or like the leader of the company? I'm sorry, not the owner, the leader of the company. Are we also like taxing the additional money that he makes more, or? So
you would have a fiscal state that you tax the income and you would redistribute in the form of welfare payments. The reason why you're getting a lot more egalitarianism, like I said, is because the fundamental problem in our capitalist system is the private ownership of wealth and the capital income from wealth. And so that would be essentially horizontally distributed in my system. Obviously, the CEO would still make, there'd be a multiple in terms of how the CEO is paid relative to the lowest paid employee, but, there wouldn't be this kind of huge differentiation of capital income and public wealth I say total wealth in society.
Sure. So what's the difference between, you're saying that the capital income would be more horizontally distributed through some kind of welfare policy. What's the difference between that and just like more taxes in our current system?
So the difference would be that, number one, my system is highly efficient relative to just raising taxes to some crazy amount. So obviously we could just raise taxes to, greatly, greatly lower the amount of wealth inequality by like raising a wealth tax. But wealth taxes are bad for the economy, right? Like wealth taxes seem to destroy investment, which isn't really good. My system would, in a number of ways, I think, incentivize investment or incentivize productivity gains, which I've mentioned before. And then with regards to capital income, right? So instead of having to tax corporations, there's so much evidence on taxing corporations and taxing capital income. There's all of these kind of, these flight problems and these problems with adherence, essentially. But you wouldn't get that if all of these things were directly publicly owned. Obviously, you just directly send the payments. Like when I own stock in Apple, I don't have a problem getting capital income from Apple. They willingly give it to me. But if I try to tax Apple, 20%, they're going to do fucking everything they possibly can do to basically avoid paying that tax as much as possible.
Don't you run into a similar problem, though, if you have competing holding companies? Like, let's say I want to be the leader of the oil engineering company that I'm doing, but I want to get paid, since I know I'm going to be horizontally distributed for my profits or whatever, I want to be compensated $20 million. Wouldn't I go from holding company to holding company and they would compete in the same way that you do in a capital market right now for high CEO compensation? Wouldn't that be like an even greater problem, since now the CEO is not even compensated with ownership, but has to be compensated directly with wages?
Yeah, well, currently, so I'm arguing for more of a cash compensation basis. But again, the cash doesn't accumulate quite like capital does, right? So you still have this kind of great horizontalization of public wealth. Now, people in my society could still be rich relative to others, but there's a big difference between, the top 10% owns 20% of the wealth and the top 10% owns 2/3 of the wealth like they do in our current society. And there's a big difference between the top 10% has like let's just call it capital income, because that's kind of what you're describing. Like the top 10% has 25% of capital income and the top 10% has 90% of capital income, which is about what it is in our current society. So I'm not saying my society would have perfect equality. It's hard for me to conceive of a society with perfect equality, but it would have much more equality than we have now.
Okay. I feel like boosting all of our tax brackets by 15 points, I think is almost inconceivable, but I think that would be more realistic. And I feel like it would affect better outcomes than this entirely new idealized system that would obviously be incredibly difficult to move to, that I think we don't really have any strong evidence of it even being possible.
Well, we do have strong evidence of, not of the ideal system, but we also don't have an ideal tax code. But that doesn't stop center left people from saying that we need things like a land value tax or these kind of like zoning reforms, these kind of like hyper yimbious stuff. I believe in all that stuff too. no government has a perfect tax code or even close to it, but I think it's still good to advocate for. I think on, principles and what we can say about what we know about taxes, it would be a good thing. And certainly I think that there's a lot of examples of public wealth and public wealth management that have gone very, very well for the people that have lived in those societies. And so I'm perfectly willing to say that, hey, in transition, Boy, fuck, we got up to 85%, public wealth ownership, and I don't know, things just aren't working out for some reason.
The transition is like transitioning from being a bodybuilder to somebody who only eats junk food constantly. The transition is very boring to me. Like, if you can eat whatever you want and have the best body ever if you're just coming off of being a professional bodybuilder. And this transition state where we have all the advantages of capitalism and all the advantages of all the accrued wealth of all of the innovation and everything else, and they're saying, oh, well, let's just own all of it, like by the state. Sure, expropriation is great on day one, but all the issues that you're running into later on is like, well, how do we decide what to invest in? Like, how are we avoiding all of the problems that we had before? It feels like we're kind of like recreating capitalism with even more bureaucratic layers that I don't know we're guaranteed to have efficient allocation of capital. And we have no like model for this working in the real world right now. So the idea that we'd be able to benefit in the same way that we are right now from all the innovation under capitalism, but also do the redistribution, I just don't find any compelling evidence right now of that. Yeah.
We don't have a model of a perfect tax code either, or like a perfect liberalism or a perfect democracy.
No, hold on. There's
right?
a difference.
So
there's a difference between a more perfect thing that we're moving in a direction of versus a system overhaul. You're talking about a fundamentally different system, not like tweaking something to make it better than what it is right now, right?
So, well, I don't know. I think in some senses I would argue that my plan is a tweak of our current system, right? I mean, because again, I tried in my system to kind of internalize the same kind of allocative and sort of investment, the allocative investment process that we currently see today under the same kinds of institutions that we see today. These asset managers, privately owned versus publicly owned, right? And we do see there's. I was just going to say one last thing, one more sentence, is that we do see a ton of examples of public wealth accumulation. And so I would agree. I would fully concede that, look, we do not know, like, essentially what the ideal system would actually do, right? But we have at least good reason to believe that the transition to that ideal system can work out very, very well, because it already has worked out very, very well in these other countries. And so I'm saying that for me, at least, for me personally, that's enough evidence to say two things. We should definitely try and make that transition, because we can make real improvements today. And then two, insofar as that continues to keep working out, we should just keep doing it, and we should keep trying to strive towards that ideal. And I don't think that's an insensible way to think about things or how to label yourself.
I think so. I think it's when I say like entirely different and not just moving in a certain direction. So like, for instance, like in the society that you're talking about, if I wanted to start a company and none of the technocratic boards or whatever were okay with that company starting, I would be disallowed from starting that company in my country. I wouldn't be allowed to do that.
Sorry, say that again, Dusty. I got distracted.
Let's say that I wanted to start a new firm that makes retro Game Boys, and none of the technocratic boards are on board with me making my new Game Boy manufacturing firm, I would be banned from doing that. It would be illegal to do that in the new country that we've created.
Well, you'd have to contract it out in some way, right? So you wouldn't be able to own the capital yourself, but obviously to the extent that manufacturing retro Game Boys would just be a specialized process of different services that you would need to do in order to do it. You could create that proof of concept, and then again, you can have a sole proprietorship where you're the one that actually kind of manages this and accumulates it, and then goes from there. But yeah,
so the sole proprietorship, I think we're using clever tricks to avoid the hard question. Because if I have a sole proprietorship, then could I not just hire 10 other 1099 people? Like, you recreated the 1099 model of, well, they're not my employees, they're just other sole proprietors. I could just recreate firms using 1099s instead of W-2s and form a like C-level structure. No. Like,
well, yeah. I mean, the way. Well, but that's a question for your regulatory state, really. So it's like, how do you view contract labor and stuff like that?
Conceptually, it's important that you, in your world,
okay, let's
if you
just
can't convince a technocratic board, you ban that. You can't just start a company that you want to.
But I'm saying I can easily just hand wave that and just say, okay, well, you can't. There's no 1099 employees, right? You have to hire like actual companies that exist that are full-time employees. Like, I don't know. It seems easy enough to just kind of say that that's a thing or a barrier that you might have to do.
But I can't hire them because I don't have the money, because I don't have capital in this society. I'm not allowed to start a business or like hire employees and stuff.
Well, in our current society, there's a lot of people with great ideas that don't have shit for money, and they can't start any business at all because it's so inegalitarian. And that was one of the points that I made earlier, is that in my society, where people are so much more egalitarian in terms of
I'm not contesting that. I'm not contesting that in your society, some people that could make companies that don't have the ability to now might be able to. That's obviously true, right? I'm sure there are some people with good ideas that can't raise the money for it. But in your society, if you did have the money for a business business that you wanted to start, but you couldn't get any of these giant holding companies on board with it, you would be disallowed from doing so.
Well, no. So you said two different things there, right? So you said, if I don't have the money, I'm just fucked, right? And I said, well, obviously there's a lot of people in our current society that don't have the money to start businesses, and they're fucked, even if it's maybe a good idea. But then you said, okay, well, what if I do have the money? It would be illegal for me to start that business. To which I said, well, no. Obviously, if you have the money to start that business, you might have to like hire a bunch of different companies to kind of like, bring those people together, and you might have to go to like the CNC, factory to, get the Game Boy whatever fucking like form or something like that, and you might have to go to another company to say, I want these kind of like motherboards to be made, and then you'd have to assemble it with some sort of technical skill. But I mean,
if I don't have the approval from a technocratic board, how do what you're describing is financial capital. How can I do that if the board doesn't approve me?
Well, but you said you have the money. So again, in my system, people would still like be able to make a lot of money, right? So let's say that you're like a rich CEO.
Okay, let me back up. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm being unclear with my terms. Okay, so money is money in the bank. I'm sorry. When I'm thinking capital, I'm thinking of investment in like private property in capital, like stuff that generates revenue or whatever. My understanding is that. So I asked earlier, like, are you allowed to hire employees and like have a firm traditionally like that? And you said no, because you have to convince the holding company to allocate you basically the model of a business that makes you the owner, or not the owner, the leader of some business. And I'm saying, okay, well, if I can't convince any of those people, even if I have the money, I wouldn't be allowed to create my firm because I haven't been able to convince any of those technocratic boards to allow me to create that firm. And it sounds like you're saying, well, you can create the firm if you have the money. You just have to hire other companies. It sounds like we're just like we're using like clever accounting ways of like recreating capitalism.
No. So again, I've already said pretty clearly that I don't think, because sole proprietors, like they necessarily don't have other employees, right? So it's just a matter of like who's actually doing like the final product distribution. Like in my society, you'd still be able to hire someone to like cut your grass for you, right? I mean, just like, because that's just like a service that you can hire for, right? And so similarly,
that's not this hiring somebody to cut your grass. You're not hiring an employee.
If I'm trying to make retro Game Boys, I can hire the CNC factory to do the molds. I can hire the computer electronics factory to do the motherboards. I can do this, that, and the other, and then I can assemble it, and then I can go out and sell it, right? Because you're just the one person who's making the final product and then selling it. That's your value add. You made the final assembly, so you can still do that in my system.
Okay, so I understand. Okay, so I understand what you're saying. So you're solving for that problem, but then if you solve for that problem by saying that if you have enough money, you can go and contract out all these other socially owned firms or whatever to do this stuff. Haven't you also reintroduced the problem of don't wealthier people then have more access to creating their dream businesses because they don't have to go to the technocratic boards and get approval? They can just do it with their own money?
Yeah. Like I said, my system is not perfectly egalitarian in any means, right? It's just so substantially more egalitarian than we see now, right? So 10% of people having 25% of the wealth or capital income or something because they're wealthy CEOs is not ideal, right? But I do think that you do need some kind of like pay inequality in order to incentivize essentially like growth and productivity and performance pay and things like that. So I've already conceded
Sure, I understand that. But at the end of the day, the only way that you're solving for this, even in your system that is far different than what we currently have, the only way that you're solving for this is still just basically taxation, right? Except your taxation is coming in the form of eating all of the profits and maybe paying less wages to people, and then you're redistributing that in the form of welfare to people that aren't making as much.
Well, but
it feels like a really complicated way to do more tax.
It's definitely not it's definitely not just taxes, right? Because again, like the accumulated wealth of the public holding corporations is also horizontally distributed, right? So when I say horizontally distributed, I'm talking about like in an accounting sense, because one person, one vote, we all kind of control public wealth or whatever. But that public wealth is not in private accounts anymore.
Well, what I say is it's basically like what you're doing is basically creating a 100% corporate tax rate, right? That's really what we're doing here.
Well, in a crude sense, you could say that, but obviously these firms would have retained profits and they would have reinvestment and stuff. They would have a dividend that they would give to the state.
But reinvestment is not tax, right? So you're just creating basically a 100% corporate tax rate. Obviously, they would still do reinvestment in business and everything. You don't tax revenues, you tax profits. And then we're just taking that 100% corporate tax rate and then we're redistributing it in the form of other welfare payments.
Again, because profits can be retained in my system, just like in our current system. So the actual dividends would be quote unquote taxed 100%. Like what you're distributing to the state is going directly to the state, obviously, right? But it's
when you say profits are retained where?
Like in the treasuries of the individual corporations.
But wouldn't that just be the giant holding companies?
Yeah, the individual corporations within the holding companies' portfolios or the holding companies themselves. Just like again, like
but those holding companies, it's not really retained in the individual companies themselves, because the holding companies could just reallocate that capital to a more profitable business if they wanted to, right?
Well,
I
think
would imagine we want them to do that, right?
they could have like a shareholders like prioritization in that regard, like what to do with the money in the corporate treasury. But again, my system has very like distributed ownership amongst these holding corporations, right? A holding corporation could say, hey, we're going to buy out 100% of Apple, and that's just going to be like our company, like we're the holding corporation that owns Apple or whatever. But I think that for the most part, you would see, similar to like BlackRock and Vanguard, you would see that BlackRock and Vanguard don't really own a lot of controlling stakes in any one company, so they only have like this like proportional influence in what corporations do with their balance sheet. That's the competitive process that I want to retain.
But then I don't understand then. So you would just have like 5 state-owned holding corporations, and then all of them would have non-controlling shares in firms.
Well, I would probably have like 100 holding corporations in my ideal sense, right? So there'd be a lot of them. Again, it would be a matter of like, what do the managers of the holding corporations think are the best investments? So they might think it's good to just buy out a company and say, we own this company outright. We think we can run it better than these other holding corporations. Or they might just say, hey, look, based on our return guidance, we're just going to go out and buy 1% of this company, 3% of that company. Again, similar to how these asset managers allocate capital today.
You keep saying similar to how these asset managers allocate, but it's not at all the same way that these asset managers allocate capital today. Their balance sheets
would look I'm saying their balance sheets would look similar to that, right? That like, sometimes they buy out companies wholesale, and then sometimes they have
fine,
very
and I probably eat
portfolio.
the same amount of calories as like an Olympic female swimmer who's like, 4'11". But it's not even remotely the same. The way that the capital is allocated and how they're making decisions is completely.
You get what
totally
I'm saying, though, Destiny.
Right?
Obviously, you get what I'm saying. That
no, hold on. I don't get what you're saying, because what you're doing is you're going to the easy part of saying like, oh, like let's just collect the profits here, but you're ignoring the whole process of how that capital is allocated initially, how firms are started, and all the incentives along the way.
I'm not ignoring it. I'm not ignoring it. So just to be clear, right? So every company today, right? If you look up Amazon stock, right? Who owns Amazon? I think Jeff Bezos owns like 15%. Retail investors own like, I don't know, like 20 or 30%. And then a bunch of different big, giant institutional investors own 1, 2, 5, 8, 7% of Amazon. That's like the ownership structure of just Amazon. So in my system, you would have, again, these big institutional investors displacing the same exact kind of like 70% ownership of Amazon as well. And they would go out and they would say, okay, I think Amazon's a good investment. I'm going to buy their stock. I'm going to hold it. I'm going to influence the board in the way that I think is valuable. And then I might sell that stock to other holding corporations or other individuals who might want to buy it on the sole proprietorship side, and go from there, right? Like, it would be still a liquid market that you could do with what you want with your money and allocate it entrepreneurially. And you're incentivized to do that because you would have things like performance pay, and you'd be able to set dividend policy, and I think that's
And what would you do? How would you decide when to end like a holding corporation? Like, what if you had some holding corporations? Like, there are different ways that I would balance my portfolio given my stage in life, right? At an earlier age, I can take a little bit more risk. Later on, I'm looking at investments that are way more stable, risk-adjusted return, and everything. How would I balance out when do you end a holding corporation? Is it when they run out of money and make bad investments, or?
Yeah, they would either be acquired by the other holding corporations, or they would be they would go bankrupt. Just like regular. They would, in theory, they would exist in perpetuity.
Wait, can holding corporations buy shares of or buy other holding corporations?
Yep, ideally.
Can we imagine what Trump would do if he controlled all these?
No, because Trump wouldn't have unilateral control from the executives to be ran by a whole different boards of people for each one.
Thank you, Destiny.
You don't think that we would be into a situation to where all of these holding companies would just ended up like held by a couple holding companies anyway? Like, if there was a holding company and they made really good decisions on how they invested in stuff, wouldn't I just want to buy some shares of just that holding company? Are we like recreating index funds here as well? Right.
So similarly, like right now, the single largest shareholder of BlackRock is Vanguard, right? One of its competitors. But they still compete against each other.
Hold on. Is it Vanguard, the institution, owns the biggest share, or is it assets under management that has bought shares of that? Because those are two very, very different things, right?
Well, obviously it's assets under management, right? I'm just talking about they're managing the assets, I suppose, but it's just about the allocative process itself. And so when it comes to the holding corporations,
hold on, wait. Those are very, very different things, right? Because in your world, these are not assets under management. These are state funds. These are initially capitalized by the state, and it's like the state that owns basically the like the totality of all of these different holding companies. So these aren't just assets under management where you can just move them from one holding company to another, right? So that I'm just saying it's a meaningfully different thing, because you keep saying like, oh, well, BlackRock owns all of this. Well, no, those are investors that invest in BlackRock and in Vanguard, and then they allocate their money that way. And those assets are managed by BlackRock and they're managed by Vanguard, but they're not Vanguard or BlackRock's funds themselves. So I think that's meaningfully different, right?
So obviously it's meaningfully different in the sense that, again, it's not individual accounts, right? So the account here would be the public. It wouldn't be like individual accounts like you're describing. But I think that in terms of just that allocative process, like, okay, can we imagine at least that this allocative process, these assets under management are being allocated by Vanguard, either passively or actively? Can we recreate that process under a public ownership ideal? I think certainly that we could with these public holding corporations. And so I can't remember the original, we got kind of sidetracked. I can't remember what your original question was. But
just if holding companies can buy other holding corporations, I feel like we're recreating
so
index funds and we're recreating everything else.
Yeah. So you said wouldn't eventually you have some concentration or anything like that, right? And so my answer is certainly yes. You would have concentration. Markets naturally concentrate kind of ownership and power to some degree, right? Because in theory, one company is better than the other ones, and people only shop there or whatever. So you'd still have this kind of concentration of ownership probably over time. But that's why my system, you still have to have fiscal actors, and you still have to have things like antitrust. So my system would ideally, and you see this all across the world, the best systems will have public-owned assets, but then they'll also have adversarial regulators that will try to ensure that they're playing by the rules, being transparent, being audited. And so my system would have the same thing.
Okay, and then I'm just curious. Well, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess, Destiny, would you say that you're skeptical of my model? Just essentially because we can't see an example of it working, right? Because obviously you would agree that, to the extent that my model is a transitionary state, it sounds like you might agree, like, yeah, the transition might be great to have something. You said, having like a public kind of stock company or something would be great. You just don't believe in 100% ownership. Maybe it has to be 60% or something like that. You just can't. It's hard to imagine going the full 100.
There's questions in getting to the full 100, but the real problem is that when people talk about public ownership, I don't think that people are ever talking about public ownership. They're talking about public profits, which are taxes. And the hard part about public ownership isn't in the getting profit. That's easy. It's the making decisions. So when we talk about the difference between like 60%, 90% or whatever, that's not really the hard part. The hard part is the difference between like 1% and like 51%, or like controlling shares in companies, because that's where all of the hard parts of capitalism in an ideal world are working. Well, in our current world, work the best is when people decide where to allocate their money towards. But if you're not being punished by profit incentive, then we have to look to other ways to guide investment. And it sounds like right now that in your system, that way would be debating, I guess, like a board of technocrats to convince them that your business idea is a good idea, and you hope
we'd have whip panels on it.
Well, yeah, my system would be punished by the profit incentive as well, right? So again, businesses can still start and fail in my system. I guess in some sense you could say that there's like extra steps to starting a business in my system. It doesn't look quite the same, which I fully concede. It is different.
Well, what's the penalty for like a holding company failing? Like, what happens?
They would go bankrupt, and everyone that works there would lose their jobs.
But they would still, they'd be fine, right?
Why would they be fine? They'd be unemployed.
Because in your system, you have massive horizontalization of all of the profits that are being controlled by all of the other holding corporations. So there's not like any real detriment at the end of the day.
Well, they would still qualify for welfare benefits, obviously, right? But people, welfare benefits only replace such a high percentage of your income, of course, right? Capital income is only like 30% of income. So, you'd still be pretty fucked if you got laid off from your job, right? So you'd still be incentivized to do a good job and not get fired, and Yeah,
I guess, but you could take I just feel like there could be so much more theoretical risk, such that if they go bankrupt all the time, it might be worth it, right? Because at the end of the day, in your system, you'd be guaranteed at least, I'm guessing, like a house, a TV, a car, the ability to have 1 month paid vacation, phone with internet, like all these things would be guaranteed. So if I was like the technocrat managing this holding corp, I'd probably be looking for insanely risky investments, because fuck it, why not, right?
Well, again, so I really don't think so, just because we see, like, for instance, we see like capital accumulation, like capital investment in many other countries that have much more generous welfare benefits than we do here, and there's a lot of papers about there's a lot of papers about this that'll say that in many different ways, just having generous welfare benefits is actually very, very good for economic growth because, like, literally kids will grow up with bigger brains and, people will feel more
Sure,
comfortable
I don't deny
taking
that,
risks,
but
right?
in all of those states that you're talking about, the capital owners are getting all of the benefit from the capital accrual. But in your system, you've eliminated that benefit. So I don't know what the...
Well, again, so capital income is only, again, about 25 to 30% of income, right? So that's being
Wait, what do you mean
horizontally...
when you say that? 25 to 30% of income, what does that mean?
All the income payments that are paid out, about 30% of it is capital income, right? So labor still makes, the vast majority of income, like total income that's paid out is paid to labor, not capital owners.
Wait, but that doesn't make any sense because if you're trying to solve for wealth inequality, you're not talking about just capital payouts. You're talking about capital accrual, right? You're talking about like increases in wealth, right?
Well,
so you have to find a way to redistribute that as well, no?
Well, so the wealth at the end of the day, so like for instance, if a holding corporation goes bankrupt, right? Those assets would go under a managed bankruptcy. They would be bought out by other investors. In this case, it'd be other holding corporations. I don't.
Well, no, I understand. But when you say 30% of stuff is paid out by capital. Like when you say that, you understand that the vast majority of the wealth that's being created in this country goes to rich people, not because they're getting dividends, but because the capital is increasing in value, right? Like Jeff Bezos isn't worth what he's worth because the Amazon stock he has is paying him sick dividends. He's worth that much because the business itself has grown to that value.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding your point. So what is your point about people would be incentivized to take infinite risk because now the capital's publicly owned, but I think they still engage in substantial... they still are substantially punished by risk if they fuck up and don't get their performance pay or get fired or their whole company goes bankrupt, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to figure out like in terms of the holding corporations, like if we're saying that if we're saying that there is like a decent upside if you pick better than anybody else, right? Because now the public funds are wait, hold on. When you're capitalizing these initial holding corporations, did they just get like the starting money and then they don't get any more money? Or how do they get more money? Or do they ever get more money?
So hard budget constraint. So they would get the initial capitalization and then any money from there, they would need to raise capital from other entities or they would need to do balance sheet financing.
Wait, what does raise capital from other entities mean?
So they would need to go take out...
raise capital from?
Well, from the competing set of other, banks that would offer capital to them, they'd have to get loans. They would have to go out and use their balance sheet, or they'd have to maybe they would go to other holding corporations and engage in joint ventures, things like that.
I feel like we're just hardcore recreating capitalism with way more paperwork in between.
So again, we're recreating the competitive dynamics of our system. Capitalism is when the ownership is privately owned, right?
Yeah, but the competitive dynamics only work because you're competing for the payout at the end, right? To some extent.
Well, I think that a lot, when you look at a lot of these corporations, right? So, a lot of these corporations do have like share-based compensation and things like that. But, I think a lot of the investment that we see here, when we think of
when you say that, a lot of these corporations have share-based compensation. The most successful corporations in our country right now are owned by disproportionately insanely wealthy people, right?
Yeah, sure.
So what is that? I don't understand what that was supposed to solve.
Because I feel like what you're saying is the thing about capitalism, the reason why we've been able to accumulate such wealth is because of this disproportionate ownership. Like you're incentivized to basically engage in entrepreneurial activity because you have the incentive of, being worth a lot of money. You have the ownership of the things that you're doing. Now, what I would say is that isn't quite right. I think that the main reason why people go out and there's a lot of different reasons. I guess your theory of entrepreneurship. A lot of people, number one, just like to do it. A lot of people are perfectly fine, like innovating, but not being owners. Like a lot of the innovations within corporations come from workers and not necessarily owners. But to the extent that those like, the sort of great man theory of capitalism, that you have like these great people who come up because of this huge incentive to accumulate wealth. Again, when we talk about, I'll make 2 points and then I'll throw it over to you. When we talk about a lot of these people and how they actually started their businesses, right? They started with a very little amount of capital investment, and then they just, it essentially like it accumulated from there, right? So the initial capital investment was quite small. So you can kind of min-max there. And then on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, what actually incentivizes people to do productive activity? I think it's more so just their compensation, right? It's just like, okay, are we providing performance-based compensation? I don't think that performance-based compensation necessarily has to be in the form of shares, right? It could just be in the form of just cash bonuses that we give to people.
I don't disagree for like employees, but I feel like owners or entrepreneurs, I think, approach it a little bit differently. They're not just looking for like high compensation or high payout necessarily. I think they're looking for like ownership of the business or the entity that they're creating. I think that's a really important part of that.
Sure. I mean, we're operating on conjecture. I don't think it's actually that important. I think that it seems to me that when I talk to really type A entrepreneurs in the world, they would tell you, look, I just love what I do and I don't give a shit and I just like doing this kind of work or whatever. And I think that when you look at a lot of the innovations that get made, a lot of it's from public investment, from individual workers at companies, like scientists that do a lot of, research they're not like wealthy business owners. They're just technically trained people that love to do what they do. Now, again, I'm not saying, just to be clear.
Love to do what they do is like, that's like a certain employees are like,
no, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Like business.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The last thing I was going to say is that, my sense is that, look, we do have to incentivize people to engage in like high value added activity, right? But I don't think that we necessarily need to incentivize that activity by having, a bunch of billionaires in society. I think that rather we can just have a bunch of CEOs that are paid, in the millions of dollars, but they're not necessarily accumulating like billions of dollars of capital to do what they do. I think that that's, to me, lines up more so with my understanding of how innovation and productivity enhancements actually happen. But Destiny, I was gonna ask you, Destiny, though, because again, what's your ideal system, right? Because it sounds like when we've spoken before that your ideal system it seems to look very similar to the Nordic model. That's why I said like, hey, if we can agree that, okay, we should get to a world where the GDP is 45% from socially owned entities instead of 20 or 30% like it is today. Like that's still a huge amount of socialization in the economy. But I don't know if you actually endorse the Nordic model. Like, what does your ideal system look like in terms of wealth distribution and who owns what?
Well, so I don't know if the Nordic model is 45% social ownership. But my ideal psychological one, which will never happen, is that if people just didn't care about wealth inequality so much, I feel like there are real psychological things that you have to actually deal with. I think you do have to care about it, unfortunately. But the second thing is that I tend to advocate for way more redistribution, because I don't think that redistribution is as much a deterrent to business owners as anything else. I do think ownership of the business is important. But I think if you were to talk to a business owner, like you're saying that, oh no, they just have a passion for what they do. But I think part of what they do is they own a thing. And that's like a thing that feels cool and good to them, because it's their business. So I think that as long as they still have their business, if you tax them even fucking 5 or 10 percentage points more, I don't think people are like, oh, I don't want to have this business anymore, fuck that. But if you just say, oh no, like this is just going to be owned by the state, or you don't get to have like controlling decisions about it, I do think that would heavily discourage people from having businesses, because fuck, well now it feels like it's not even my thing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
So I basically just more redistribution. I think that Yeah,
so I think I guess I just disagree. I think that there's a lot of evidence that taxes, and especially the kinds of taxes that politicians are likely to favor, are very bad for the economy, right? Like, for instance, even in the Nordic economies, which I do uphold, they have really inefficient tax systems, which many papers would show you are pretty bad for their economy at large. But obviously, they're not like so bad that it destroys the economy. They're just like marginally worse. And so,
I mean, I agree with you, but I think there are some taxes that are really good. They're just politically unpopular. Like I think that most economists like property taxes. I think are good, and I think that income taxes I think are good. Progressive income taxes, and these are both very good taxes, but they're like the least popular ones politically, and everybody fucking hates them. But I think that like some of the worst taxes that people talk about are things like financial transaction taxes, which we're not really talking about here, I guess, because we don't have like stock markets as much anymore in your system. But then the other hated tax is the corporate tax, and your system is essentially like a 100% corporate tax rate system, and I feel like it's one of the most inefficient ones that most economists think is a bad tax.
But that's why I made it very clear, right? So there is a huge difference between a 100% corporate tax and owning 100% of a business, right? So for instance, I don't think that it makes the business I don't think that we would have to make the argument that the shareholder structure of Amazon makes Amazon less productive because they send out, I don't know if Amazon pays a dividend, but whatever. They pay a dividend out, or they pay return capital to their shareholders, right? That's a totally different thing than, does the tax from the state cause negative things to happen to the operations of that business? There's a lot of papers that show that corporate taxes are bad for business accumulation and business formation, but there's not a lot of papers that say that basically just paying out dividends are bad, because that's your incentive. You're incentivized to do that as a corporation. You're supposed to return capital to your shareholders.
Yeah, but you can return capital a ton of different ways. I don't think there's much difference between dividends versus just the value of the stock increasing, for instance.
Yeah, but you're making an efficiency argument and describing my system as 100% corporate tax, when that's really not it. My system doesn't take all the corporate profits and mandatorily extracted away from the business. My system has a system where corporations...
No, not the business, the owners of the business. Profits are for the owners of the business, right?
Right. Well, the owner, again, in my system, the owners wouldn't just literally like scrape off like all the profits from the business. There would be a dividend policy decided by the board that was on balance what we could return to shareholders with the actual long-term interests of this corporation, similar to what we see now. I hate saying that because you seem to not like when I say that, but the point is...
Hold on, wait. I'm just, you're the business... I don't know why you can't own. I'll buy bullets in my system. You have to bite the bullet on this. There are no profits in your system for the business. Those all are gone. Those all go to the state, to the holding companies to be distributed.
Why would they be gone? I don't understand. Why would a corporation...
Because if profits still exist in some manner to be redistributed to the people working at that business, you've just recreated all of capitalism. Because now when these holding companies are looking to invest in businesses, employees are only going to work for businesses that have like profitable distribution structures, and then holding companies are going to invest in businesses that have more profits.
No, but you're not.
But then you just recreated capitalism and all the wealth inequality.
Market competition is not capitalism. Capitalism is when production is privately owned. In my system, production is publicly owned, but you still have market competition. So obviously a business, like we said at the very beginning of the conversation.
Wait, stop, hold on, wait, this doesn't make sense. It can't be publicly owned if the profits are private.
No, so the profits are
managed.
Can't be
private in a publicly owned system.
No, so it's not about the profits. The profits are not privately owned in the sense that the people who are deciding what to do with the profits are individual investors, right? I'm advocating for, you said the hard part is the decision-making process. So I'm being what I think to be in-depth about the decision-making process. The decision-making process would be technocratic, and it would be very similar to what we see.
Vague.
It's not.
If I work for a company and there's
for fuck's sake.
Listen.
Technocratic.
That's not saying anything. I'm asking, let's say
I didn't finish what I was saying.
I know, but you're just saying general. Okay, I work for a firm and it's got $1 trillion in profits. Where does that $1 trillion in profits go?
So the board of that, similar to today, fuck's sake, the board of that company would make a decision on how much profits do we need to retain? What do we want to use those profits for? How much profits based on our dividend guidance can we actually send to the owners? That's how fucking Amazon works, fucking Apple works, Tesla works. They all do that. They have a general dividend guidance where they want to send a certain amount of capital to their shareholders, but then they obviously keep a lot of their profits for things like reinvestment, for things like paying down debt, and for things like employee compensation. But that's not like a radical departure from what we see now. The radical departure is who owns the capital.
Profits are not ever for employee compensation, right? Profits are the excess that you have after everything else, including cost of labor. Profits are the things you have that you return to the shareholders, right? But in your world, I can't tell who the shareholders are. So the shareholders
in our system, we do not return 100% of the profits to the owners of the company. Now, you're right to say that the owners of the company
That's what you're supposed to do. What do you mean?
You're absolutely... Destiny, okay. Do you think when Amazon makes $1 billion in profits, shareholders get $1 billion check?
If there's nothing else to invest the money in, yes.
Right, exactly. If there's they have to make the decision. If there's nothing else to invest the money in, if we've paid out all of the shit that we need to pay out, if we don't want to pay down our debt, then we send the rest to the shareholders. But that's not the same thing as a 100% shareholder tax, and my system's not 100% corporate tax, because businesses would have to say, hey, we've paid all of our employees, we don't have anything else that we want to invest in, we have this money that's left over, we have this dividend guidance, that's how much money we're going to send to our shareholders, which happens to be the public in my system.
Which is all the profits.
No, it's not. It's not all the profits, because a lot of the profits are retained and used for other investing activities or used for recapitalization.
Yeah, that's reinvested. That's like sure, but that's like reinvested stuff. Is not the excess money that you make at the end of everything else, right?
But what's taxed in a corporate tax is not money after basically every single investment you make. It's just the accounting profit of the business, right? Obviously with a lot of complications, but you get what I'm saying. Like corporate taxes tax a much broader set of money than just money that's finally available to shareholders.
Isn't in a general sense, isn't that generally what corporate taxes are aimed at? Like you don't generally tax like revenues, right? It sounds like you're talking about revenues, and I'm talking about profits.
No, but again, you do tax corporate profits, right? But there's a difference between corporate profits and essentially retained earnings, which are used to pay out dividends, right? Retained earnings are not the same thing as corporate profits.
Wait, why you keep saying dividends? Dividends are profits.
No. Okay, I use the technical term. Retained earnings, that's the money that's used to pay out dividends and to return capital to shareholders. That's not the same thing as the profits that are taxable from a corporate profit perspective. Those are different things.
So you're saying, hold on. So you're saying that the dividends that a company pays out, corporate taxes don't apply at all to that?
Yeah, no. So it
So if I
applies
own
to
a
both.
business
That's
and
what
I
I'm
say
saying.
I'm never going to withdraw anything. I'm just going to pay myself a 100% dividend from all the extra
No,
money. I don't have to pay
that's
corporate taxes on that dividend.
the
Yeah.
corporate. Yeah. So it applies to both labor and capital. So the corporate tax, because it taxes a broader base than essentially just distributions to capital, when you actually study the incidence of corporate taxation, it falls to both labor and capital because businesses are
Hold on a
taxed.
sec. When you talk about incidence of taxation, you say it falls to labor. It falls to labor such that the company might choose to pay them less, but not because it's a direct tax on the labor itself. It only falls to labor in the same way that tariffs probably are about 50-50 between the consumer and the producer, but not because the producer, China, is actually paying the tariffs, but because they're going to have to drop the price a little bit in order to remain competitive in the market. And it's like about 50-50 at the end of the day, but it doesn't mean they're paying the tariff.
Well, but just think about it conceptually.
Pay corporate taxes.
So
Sure.
just think about it conceptually, right? So if the business has a certain amount of profits that it wants to use for investment, right? Because we're taxing corporate profits and not retained earnings, then the amount of money that the corporation has for investment goes down, right? And so
Wait, so let's say the corporation has $1 billion in profits, and then it wants to reinvest that $1 billion in profits into more capital. Are you saying that $1 billion in profits is facing a corporate tax rate in our current system?
So I'm sorry, say it again. I didn't understand what you're saying.
If I reinvest all my profit into my business, am I paying taxes on the profit that I reinvest into my business?
So that's one of the problems with our current tax is that we don't exempt investment activities completely, right? We have things like depreciation where you actually end up being overtaxed on what you're actually investing in, right? That was one of the things about this latest OBBBA.
Now we're super nibbling around the edges at this point. I understand that there are certain classes of reinvestment that might not have the best tax treatment in a corporate tax system, but I'm saying that if I have a business and I have $1 billion in profits, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to buy a whole new fleet of vans, or I'm going to buy a whole new facility or whatever. Generally speaking, this money would generally speaking be tax exempt. There might be some particular cases around.
Generally. No, depreciation
that's not the case.
Depreciation. Okay, if you buy a factory, if you buy a factory and it costs $100 million, there's all these complex rules for how to depreciate that asset and actually claim the tax write-off. So if you spend $100 million in profit, or you have $100 million in profits, and you decide I'm going to buy a fucking, a factory with this money, right? The government is still going to extract some of that money from you. So you're either not able to build the full amount of your factory, or you have to have more money to build the full factory because you're only able to claim, like, say, 10% of the value of that factory as a tax deduction on an annual basis. So all I'm saying, and this, retained earnings, which is my understanding is the money that's actually used to pay out dividends and return capital to shareholders, that is a smaller pot of money after you're actually already have paid your corporate tax money. The only reason we got off on this is because you described my system as similarly inefficient or similar to paying 100% corporate tax, but it's not. My system is, to a pretty radical degree, much more efficient. Like if you had a 100% corporate tax rate, the economy would essentially be destroyed. But my system doesn't.
So I can't tell you every single thing about every depreciation schedule. I do know that in general, depreciating things over time is more beneficial than depreciating it all up front, right? That if I had $100 million of income or revenues this year, next year, the year after, I would want to depreciate on a time scale instead of depreciating all up front, because in terms of like tax brackets and everything else, like generally speaking is better. Well, actually, wait, I don't know if there are different corporate tax brackets, but generally, like, spreading this out over time is helpful. I know there are some things that you can do full depreciation up front as opposed to doing it over time, but I don't know the individual depreciation schedule.
That's my offense, right? That's my offense, is that I think that your system, you're saying basically, look, I would just tax more and redistribute more. I don't necessarily care about like the public wealth accumulation. I guess you did endorse the sovereign wealth fund, but it's not clear like how big the sovereign wealth fund would be. But like,
well, sure, but I also don't think, again, sovereign wealth fund, that's just a big retirement account. They're not making decisions about things. They're still collectivizing like the means of production, because obviously they're buying a lot of equities with that money, right? So it's just a matter of how big the sovereign wealth fund would be. So that's why I'm saying your system is kind of like a down payment in some sense on my system. But I think that your system, by ultimately requiring a higher tax burden on society, because society isn't just getting the direct dividend payments from all these corporations, is marginally less efficient, because we have a lot of evidence. We have a lot of evidence that, taxes like that are just, they're not really good for your economy. Sure. Ideally everybody would make enough money to not need any wealth redistribution at all. I don't understand, what is the okay, wait. Okay, I have one question, but before we get to that, I'm just trying to go back. Okay. So if there is a company, and this company is a highly profitable company compared to another company that's not as profitable, are the employees in the highly profitable company just getting a whole bunch of extra money, or are the other employees, or is all that money going to the holding company and then it's just...
Well,
Are you investing in other companies that it's holding?
yeah,
it has holdings of,
I
or
would,
how's it?
I would expect my system would have a similar pay structure to today, where larger, more profitable businesses tended to pay more. That probably would happen, yeah.
Okay. And then the profits of any of those, so the extra money they make after paying out everything, are those profits going to the holding company to invest in other companies, or is it just sitting in the bank account for potential future investment?
I'm sorry. So is the money is the money in the treasury? What are they doing with the money that they keep in their treasuries?
Yeah.
Well, they would. So it would. Yeah. So they would do whatever they think would be most productive with it, right? So they could accumulate that money for a future investment that they want to make. They could make current investments. They could, redo their compensation structure if it's uncompetitive. They could pay down their debt. They could obviously start completely. Well, I already said they could do new investments, right? They could do acquisitions with it. So I mean, anything basically that they think would be for the best long-term, maximization of value of the business.
Okay. And then at what point do they extract surplus value from the company for like redistribution to the rest of society? Is that just like a flat percentage amount, or what?
Yeah, so I think that I've kind of described it as like they would have a general guidance. So for instance, when you look at the way that the Nordic companies or the Nordic countries manage their state-owned enterprises, the ones that they operate commercially, for profit, what they do is they have a basic dividend guidance. They say, hey, we want you to return, a 6% rate of return to our initial investment, which is to say some kind of loose dividend guidance that they would give. So, hey, we want you to return capital such that you're either becoming 6% more valuable and you're returning, a certain amount of dividends to the company or to the country at large. And so I think that you'd have this kind of loose guidance. And then to the extent that companies kind of regularly fail to meet their guidance, there need to be some kind of explanation for why that is. But then companies would also, you'd also probably have some incentives for paying extraordinary amounts of dividends. Again, you'd have like performance pay and things like that as well.
Okay, so then just curious, because my next question goes into what you kind of just said. So what other country are you looking at for guidance here? You talked about the 6% return. Who are you talking about there? Is that Norway?
I think this was a Swedish report, their state ownership report from 2022, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, and then like what percentage of firms are owned by the state? Are we talking about like competitive firms that sell goods and services in non-monopolistic markets? So we're not just talking about like energy corporations and stuff, right?
No, yeah. So Sweden has a mixture of a bunch of different state-owned enterprises. They're not doing exactly what I'm describing. I was just using there as an example of how they would manage essentially extraction of profits from these companies. But what Sweden does is they have a bunch of different state-owned companies. They separate these companies into two buckets. One is commercial. One is like essentially commercial plus, where you have commercial enterprises that are meant to essentially just maximize profits, and then you have commercial enterprises that have other social goals. An example of each would be like one enterprise. I'll use Norway as an example because I'm more familiar. Like Equinor would be an example of a purely commercial enterprise. There's no social goals associated with Equinor. But Norway also has a state ownership company, which is based around essentially creating art. It's like, hey, we put on plays and we put on, art galleries and stuff like that. Like we have a balance sheet and we have like a profit and loss statement, but we're not like really expected to make money. This is almost more of like a social service with transparent accounting. That's how they do it.
Okay, wait. Okay, so I'm just curious. So like I look up Sweden and it looks like Sweden literally has like 43 enterprises that they own. And like 60% of the portfolio value is in energy related stuff.
Right.
Okay. So is Norway closer to what you were talking about, or?
You're saying, oh, you're just looking for examples of my system?
Or yeah, like the closest thing, like what, like directionally, because you keep saying saying that like your system is more efficient, and I don't know how you say that with no evidence, but then you're vaguely alluding to
Yeah, I think in terms of an institutional framework, Norway and Singapore are the closest.
Okay, and then what part of Norway are we looking towards here?
What part of Norway? Like their sovereign wealth fund and their state-owned enterprises and their government services.
Okay, but for Norway, isn't their sovereign wealth fund like over 60% invested in like other capitalist economies with capitalist firms and capitalist frameworks?
Yeah, so again, my ideal system would still have a stock market, and you'd still have liquid markets for things, right, that you could monitor. So it's not in contradiction to my system. I would say another thing is that one of the reasons why, they have two main reasons.
How can you have a stock market? Why would I ever buy a stock?
Well, so you might buy a stock because you're a sole proprietor retail investor, but then obviously the holding corporations and the different capital managers would also want to buy stocks on a liquid market because it's just
Well,
maybe
no,
a
I
good
understand why
investment.
they would want to buy stocks because they're redistributing the profits to the end of the day back to the state. But why would I, like, and as an individual, can I buy stocks in a company?
Yeah, so like I said, I think you'd probably have some system for like individual retail ownership. I mean, to the extent that that's offensive to the socialists because there's some like, I guess technically you're an equity owner, right? Then you could always just say, okay, well, we're only going to do things with these private holding corporations, but that's kind of beside the point. The point is,
that's not technically, that is the point, right? Is you're part of the ownership class when you have stock in a company.
okay, Dusty,
But
my only
retail,
point.
that's it? Okay.
My only point is that you would still have a stock market. You'd still be incentivized to list public shares because that's a way to raise capital on a public market, right? So I mean, there'd still be like a liquid financialization of assets in my market. The only reason I brought up the stock market was because in Norway,
But why would you? No, this doesn't make any sense because you're saying that you would go to these technocratic boards in order to get financing. Why would you also have to raise money from individuals as well who aren't even allowed to have significant ownership because? Like you said, you can't hire employees and stuff in your economy. I don't understand how you could be like a stock owner.
Well, right now in our system, you can go to like wealthy investors and just get like private capital investment, but then there's also an incentive to like go public with your company because there's certain advantages related to going public. The main advantage being that although it does come with additional responsibilities, the main advantage being that you have easier access to capital if you wanted to like list shares in the future. And so the same incentive would exist in my current system or in my system.
No, hold on. You can't keep saying the same incentive. It doesn't make any sense. You just started that off with a company that goes public. That's after you've already gotten a large initial investment from another owner class person. These people will be eliminated in your society. They don't exist anymore. You cannot have an individual that is capitalizing a business. All businesses initially must be capitalized by your holding companies.
So they would be capitalized by the holding corporations, but again, you'd still be incentivized to go public because I'll just use one example. Let's say that you have a company, you're going to start a shoe company. Hey guys, I want money to start this shoe company, right? It's like, okay, sweet. You seem like a good guy. We're going to give you $5 million to start this shoe company. Let's just say it explodes in value. Oh shit, now it's worth $100 million and we want to now go public. So now it's essentially entirely owned by the holding corporation as a private entity. It's not publicly traded, right? But now it's like, okay, well, fuck, it's worth $100 million. And this holding corporation says, you know what, we want to list these shares and kind of have these other holding corporations buy us out because this has been such a good investment for us. And we have these other things that we want to invest in. We either want to pay down our debt. Sorry, Wick, what were you saying?
Or whatever say no? If the holding company wants to go public, but the CEO or whatever doesn't want to, who wins that fight?
Well, I think board members would be a mixture of the state in the form of the holding corporations themselves and the workers at each individual firm. So if the workers at the firm and also the holding corporation appointees decided, hey, this is a good idea, like they would just have a vote and a discussion, and that's how that decision would go forward. And they would be the same people that would ultimately. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Okay.
I was just going to say that
Yeah, go ahead.
You would vote to go public because the holding corporation might say, hey, this has been a really profitable private investment for us, but we think that we can allocate a lot of this money more efficiently if we're able to extract out and be able to be bought out from part of our ownership. Same reason why people go public today. Hey, we want to either make a lot of money and use that money for some other purpose. In the case of a rich investor, it's like we might use that money just to consume it, might use it to start another company. And the same thing, the holding corporation would have the exact same incentive. Hey, we think that we can list our shares.
You keep saying the exact same incentive.
Destiny, you keep not understanding what I'm saying.
The
holding corporation. No,
when you go public, the reason why you're going public is because you have a failure to access a lot of capital. But in your system, you've got these capitalized holding firms that already have access to theoretically infinite capital or close to infinite capital. You're talking about going public to.
That's an incomplete understanding of why corporations go public. They don't go public just because they want to access more capital. The process of going public is buying out current investors, right? Buying out current investors. You're not listing new shares on the secondary market. That money doesn't go to the corporation. It goes to current owners, right? And so when a holding corporation says, hey,
definitionally, when you go public, it gives you the ability to issue shares to additional owners. I believe it's 500. I think is the limit for a C corp before you're. I might be thinking of a C corp. But wait, you're saying if you don't go public to raise more capital, what do you go public for? What's the point of going public?
Okay, we've got the shoe company. It's privately owned.
No, wait, just right now today. What is the point of going public for a corporation? You said I don't understand it. I thought the reason why you go public is because you want to raise additional funds, especially from the public market. You don't have to sell like all of your equity to one person. What's the point of going public?
right? You can raise more shares than, or I guess you can raise more shares essentially and have some of that be like retained for the corporation. But a big reason why a lot of companies go public is just because current owners want to be bought out and they want to either use that money for some lavish consumption or they want to reinvest in other ventures. And so a holding corporation might say, hey, look, this is our private, we're the only holding corporation that owns this company and it's really profitable, but we think that either this corporation needs broader access to capital because our balance sheet can't handle it, or we want to make a shitload of money and get our performance pay.
Okay, I understand. Help me here, okay? I understand what you're saying, okay? But part of the going public is being listed on exchanges, having broad access to a whole bunch of different investors. But in your world, we already have all these holding firms that are able to look at all these other things. Like, for instance, if you do a startup business, your goal to make money, to get bought out, isn't to go public. Your goal is to sell to a larger business, right? So I just don't understand in your world why, like, other firms can always buy percentage shares of some company. They don't have to go public for other people to buy equity in the company. Like, I don't think going public would ever happen because every firm can see the entire market anyway. They would have access to all of this information regardless. They're like, yeah, I don't know why no company would ever go public. Everything's basically already public anyway, I think.
So no, because the shares aren't actually listed and open for liquid sale, right? Like that's the big difference between private and public. Is like it's much easier to list shares in the future if you want to raise additional capital, but then it's also much easier for your shares to be bought out because it's a way bigger pool of people that are interested in your shares.
So just one more clarifying question then. So when you're starting a business in your model, when you start that business, the holding firm has 100% of the shares of your company and nobody else can buy or sell or trade shares? Because I thought before you were saying that people could buy percentages of companies. Is that only...
Well, right, but those would be the companies that are publicly traded, right? So you'd still have privately traded businesses. So that's why I mentioned joint ventures earlier as well, that you might have a situation where two holding corporations say, hey, we want to do this joint venture together and we just own it 50-50, or maybe it would just be, like you said, just 100% owned by one holding corporation, because again, private companies, like you said, sometimes do have diverse capital stacks, but a lot of the times those private companies are just 100% owned by, single people.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And so again, I just think...
You said the Nordic model is the next, is the thing that you like the most. But I feel like you point to the sovereign wealth fund a lot, but I feel like the sovereign wealth fund is literally just investments into other capitalist economies and firms in capitalist economies.
That does bring up a question, just real quick for you, kind of boy. Yeah. How would this system work with other countries? Like, would a holding company be allowed to invest in a country with a different economic model and do things with that? Like, how would they interact? What would the interaction look like?
Yeah. I mean, I think foreign investment and foreign direct investment would be things in my system, right? So to the extent that the holding corporations thought that it would be, a value proposition to do, entrepreneurial activity outside of the country, they could do that. And to the extent that a foreign company wanted to, I guess to some degree, if you wanted to enter into, like, say, a joint partnership with like a foreign company because you thought that it would be, substantially more efficient, you could do that as well.
Yeah, like I want to pay really low wages in China to make my sneakers, right?
Yeah, Wick. Hey, if you're criticizing my system because of trade, then I've got some bad news about capitalism, right? So again, our current system would have foreign markets and allocation, right?
And if you think that's bad, how does your system improve it?
So my system, this is one of the criticisms of social democrats in general, is that we don't have an internationalist model. That my system, to the extent that we can improve things like foreign trade relations and climbing the value chain in other countries, that's a fiscal problem. What would the government do to try and do that? But I don't know that there's a clean way to really accomplish that from a pre-distributive side from the companies in the public wealth's portfolio. So my system doesn't really, to the extent that my system raises a lot more money for the government, in theory, we could have more foreign aid and, things like that with other countries. But that's been one of the criticisms for basically any non-internationalist socialist model. I don't have a good way to, other than just basically saying all the other countries should do the same thing that I'm describing. But our current system is pretty terrible in that regard as well. And sorry, so
one more question from my end. Yeah. If the workers in a company who obviously, well, I guess I'll just ask, the workers in a company, say a company started, the workers have the board or whatever the company has say in how that company is run. Is that correct, right? Say the holding company. Yeah. The holding company disagrees with the company, right? So the holding corporation that invests in the company and things like that, they have a disagreement with the workers or the board of that company. Who wins that fight? right?
Well, obviously, the boards of the corporations within the holding company would be appointed by the holding company, so you can't really have like disagreement between these boards, right? I mean, it'd be like saying like
It's
what
like-
if it'd be like saying what if the shareholders disagreed with the board of Amazon? It's like, well, I mean, they would just kick out the board and do.
Well, I
like,
think
a
he was
new
saying the
board.
shareholders disagree with the employees.
Yes, the employees, the
well-
workers, the company. I work for the shoe company under this holding employee. We've gotten together and we say, you know what? We're not being compensated enough for what we do. This percentage that the board, the holding company, is giving us is just not enough. We want more.
Well, my system would have a essentially a tripartite structure of unionization and like worker board management, right? So if the workers were really pissed off about how the holding corporation was treating them, they could go on strike.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I believe in union. Again, like my system, I think it's important to have things like unions and stuff like that. But that's independent of my system. You can have, and many countries do have, publicly owned corporations that are still union. Like we have the USPS, and they have a separate union, even though it's socially owned. And so my system would do the same thing. To the point, Destiny, that you made about Norway and its sovereign wealth fund is kind of like.
Hold on, fuck. I'm sorry. You keep saying the same thing, and it triggers the fucking. I'm so sorry.
You mentioned. I haven't
my guess is
addressed
the
your
reason.
point.
I just wrote the reason why the postal system, I guess, is probably has a union is because there's a sole. It's a one owner market. It's a monopoly, right? The United States of America or the U.S. Postal Service is the sole employer of like U.S. Postal Service workers. So you kind of need a union there because you have no negotiating power otherwise. But in your world, you would have multiple holding firms that are all competing against each other. So the necessity for a union isn't necessarily the same strength as you'd need one against a single state-owned thing, right?
Well, there's a lot of public employees that aren't represented by a union, and there's a lot of private employees that are and are not. This kind of matrix includes, all of those different possibilities. I'm just saying that the question of like essentially how do we empower workers in my system is a similar struggle that we see today. That like we need to have a system of unionization and kind of like worker board membership in an ideal sense to try and represent the interests of both the society that controls ultimately all these corporations, but then also the workers themselves who want to have good standards of living and not be miserable.
Sure.
Yeah. And so anyway, to address your point about Norway, so they're sovereign. They do have two sovereign wealth funds. One of their sovereign wealth funds is invest domestically. One is invest in foreign companies. The foreign one is, I think it's like 5 or 6 times as big as the one that's invested domestically. And there's two main reasons why it's invested in foreign companies. One of the reasons is that, number one, Norway is just a hugely oil-rich country, right? So they literally they want to diversify away from their economy because not doing so would be like terrible for their economy because they're so oil dependent. And the second reason is that their domestic liquid capital market is really quite small because they essentially have more oil wealth than they have private capital accumulation in some sense, right? And so they kind of have to invest in like other liquid markets. The Oslo Stock Exchange, I think in a given year is something like 30 or 40% owned by the domestic sovereign wealth fund. So the United States, by having such a huge amount of liquid wealth already domestically, I did a calculation based on a huge data set that I pulled. It was something like 20% of GDP is produced by just all of the different 4,000 publicly traded corporations. All those corporations are publicly traded, so in theory, they're very easily to socialize, right? You just buy out the shares. And so the United States actually has kind of a unique advantage relative to Norway when it comes to utilizing a sovereign wealth fund to socialize the means of production.
But we have no guarantee that it would function anywhere similarly to the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, though, right?
Well, at least
because
the sovereign wealth fund would, right? Because even you've endorsed the sovereign
because
wealth fund.
the sovereign, but I don't talk about buying out all the companies, right? The Norwegian sovereign wealth fund probably owns very small stakes in everything that it invests in internationally that are all capitalist economies that it's all deriving most of its money from. You're talking about the United States buying wholesale or 50% plus ownership, controlling shares in all other domestic companies. There's no reason to assume that the returns on the profits or whatever there would be as beneficial as the returns on the Norwegian social wealth fund profits.
Well, yeah, but again, so the holding corporations and the sovereign wealth funds themselves would be competing against each other. So they would still have, they'd still have like kind of minority ownership, and they'd be, selling and buying these shares in a competitive process. So I think that we would still be able to have what you're describing, like not necessarily like single entity controlling shares. It's just when you accumulate all the public ownership, it ends up being controlling shares, but it's still like a competitive process of distributed board appointments and, technocratic management, which I think is really, really important to maintain. And again, I think that and I guess we might be circling the drain here, but I think that my system is superior to yours because my system, number one, and I think directly addresses the problem of what private wealth accumulation. And your system, by relying on tax revenue, I think relies on, by the literature that I'm familiar with, a less efficient means to socialize the returns to capital and certainly to.
Hold on, wait. Just to be clear,
wealth.
we both rely on the exact same mechanisms, right?
So again, I don't think that my system is equivalent to a corporate tax, but I don't want to.
Okay, wait. If you're a janitor and you're working in your system, where are you getting all of your money from?
Where you work.
How is that place generating that much money?
To pay a janitor? What do you?
Yeah, janitors are not making the same amount as like an engineer. If you're like working at think of whatever the poorest fast food worker, the poorest compensation job.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, so janitors don't work at like the janitor company, right? So like there are cleaning services companies, right? But I mean, a lot of janitors are employed by corporations directly, and so you'd have a similar diverse structure for how, employees are hired and like what kind of employees are getting hired at certain companies.
Sure, but then let's say it's for a small restaurant. Where are the janitors in that company, or in the small restaurant company? Where are those people getting the majority? They would need to get a lot of money from the state, right?
Well, they would be hired either from the balance sheet of or the cash flow operations of the restaurant itself, right? So they would either hire janitors directly, or they would contract out that service to like a cleaning company.
The janitors in that society, in your society, would have to be getting all of the profit like distribution from also like the giant Amazons of your society as well. It relies on some tax mechanism and some social redistribution.
They would be, so what you do with the dividends is just a question for your fiscal state. So you're right. So you could just directly give everyone a check. If I think if capital income,
you keep using these terms to hand wave away what I'm saying.
Directly.
You say,
I'm not,
wait. You said that your system directly addresses like income inequality or directly addresses distribution of wealth. And I said that, no, we rely on the same mechanisms. And then you just said, well, that's a question for the fiscal state. That's yes. So, the fiscal state is what deals with wealth redistribution through taxation.
Okay. So in my system, 100% of capital income, like in an ideal system, obviously, 100% of capital income is socialized. In your system, maybe you can raise the capital gains tax to 60%, but that's going to fucking like destroy the economy, right? Like we know that capital gains taxes are bad for investment allocation. They're bad for investment distribution, right? Like it disincentivizes investment. So that's what I'm saying.
But in your system, we have no idea if your system works at all, to be fair. Okay. Because you can't say that, well, in your system it work perfectly, but in mine it would destroy. We have no idea.
We know 60-70% capital gains taxes don't work, right? So I mean, I think that my system, it maybe would have a shot of working.
We don't know if your system could even maintain a functional society. So I don't think that's fair to say that we can just assume that. But I'm just saying that in your system you have no examples of it, so you can't possibly disagree with that.
Because we have even like really bad socialist systems like the USSR, for instance, right? A terrible, awful socialist system. They had a functioning society, right? Like it wasn't like the whole entire society collapsed, right? Wick, is that funny? Hold on. Hey, Wick, is that funny?
Because the Soviet Union literally did collapse. Okay,
no,
so I don't
know. The Soviet Union did collapse because again, that was a shit socialist system. I've already said it's terrible, right? But again, to say like we don't even know if your system would even like society might collapse if your system happened. There's so many substantial reasons to think that my system would work much better than the USSR, and the USSR for 100 years had like a country and a government, and they had services and things like that. Obviously, it was a terrible fucking country.
Like 60 years?
Yeah, it wasn't 100.
What was it? It was like the 1917 revolution all the way to the 90s. So I mean, that's like
the 90, 91.
Yeah, about 70.
80 years, not 100. Okay, whatever.
We'll say about 70 years. But okay, I'm just saying that. Back to the directly addressed thing, right? In your ideal world, the people at the Amazon Corporation would be making way more than the people at the Pancake House Corporation. You'd have to find a way to get the.
Do you at least concede the point that we cannot literally have a 100% capital gains tax? We can't have a 100% wealth tax. That your system, you keep saying that your system accomplishes the same.
I wouldn't want to tax that way. I don't know. I wouldn't want to tax. I wouldn't tax. I would agree that would be horrible. I think corporate tax should be zero in the United States.
Right. So we don't have. So that's in my view, that's a distinct advantage of my system, is that it's much more egalitarian. You couldn't get the egalitarianism of my system under your system because your system runs into upper limits of tax. basically.
Well, but we can't talk about any of the other layers of your system because it's highly theoretical. But I'm just saying that you still need a government entity to reallocate money from one business to the employees of another business. Now, my system does it with taxation. You might have a different name for it in your system, but in your system, the guy that works at the Pancake House versus the guy that works in Amazon's AWS cluster, the excess profit that he generates has to go to that Pancake House employee at some point. You can call it whatever you want, but it's at some point it has to be redistributed back fiscally.
That's what I've said. So you interrupted my explanation, but I thought I was directly answering it. The reason I said it's a fiscal decision is because you could do substantially anything with that money, right? So I mean, you could do a UBI. Let's just say that you do a UBI. Okay, so all the capital income, I think it's something like $4 or $5 trillion a year, is kind of like evenly distributed amongst all people, all adults. That's about $1,500 a month, right? I mean, that's not like an amount of money that.
I agree with you. I think you could do it, but at that point, it's not intrinsic to your system if you're using a UBI. That's the same thing as me doing welfare, right?
So yeah, that's what I'm saying. You could tax and spend such that you get a $1,500 a month UBI, but what I'm saying is that the taxes that you would rely on would be much more detrimental to the economy than my system of socialization of capital. And obviously you disagree, but I mean that's my point. I think my system's more economically efficient.
Okay, I wanna start. We are circling the drain so much, but I do have a couple questions. All right. For
hit us
you
with
guys.
the chat
you guys
questions.
Callers in, right?
Hey, callers, why not?
Do that for a little bit, but Econoboy, I guess.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you. You mentioned banks earlier, right? Like, oh, they'll just get like loans for the banks and things like that. Do banks exist in your system as private entities?
Banks would exist as, entities owned by the public holding corporations.
Fair enough. So what is, in your opinion, I'm going to ask the opposite question, Destiny, but for you, what is, in one way, what ways is capitalism better, right? What pros does capitalism have that you would have to see that your system, well, we just can't handle this as much, but I think my system is better overall, but here, and here, I think capitalism does better. And I'm going to ask the opposite question to Destiny in a minute. Go ahead.
I'm a little confused. You're asking me to say what are the best things about capitalism?
Steelman capitalism for me, and I'm going to ask him to Steelman socialism, okay?
Yeah, I think the best argument against my system from a socialist perspective is that, like I said, it's not very internationalist in nature. It doesn't necessarily address between country inequality as well, other than those countries just adopting the same system that I'm advocating for, but that's a little bit harder. It's hard for me to say that the Mexicans should do one thing and the Canadians should do another thing. So that's probably one left-wing criticism of my system. In terms of capitalist criticisms of my system, or like Steelman capitalism from a more centrist perspective, I would say that one of the arguably most fundamental problems with my system is that you do require a very, very ideal institutional framework. That it's very sensible to say, well, Econoboy, look at all these examples, right? Like this book, The Public Wealth of Nations, right? It's not all like jerking off examples of public wealth. There's a whole chapter of that book dedicated to failed public wealth experiments because governments oftentimes run public wealth into the fucking ground. And so it's totally fair to say, by my system being so state reliant, that I'm essentially requiring a kind of a perfect state or kind of an ideal set of circumstances for it to run well. I happen to think that it's possible or probable that we could do that, but that's a big disadvantage of my system relative to a distributed system of private ownership.
Okay, same question to Destiny. Econoboy socialism, or socialism with Econoboy characteristics, if you want to call it that.
That's what I like to call it.
What from what you've heard is probably the ways that you could find, if any, that it outperforms the current capitalist model?
I think one of the biggest issues that I think we're facing today, to quote the wise economist Gary's economics, but I think that capital is conferring massive advantages onto capital owners, and I think there's a massive gulf growing between those that own capital and those that don't. And I think that finding a way to bring like wealth accrued via capital ownership into a more state-owned and state-distributed enterprise. I mean, theoretically, if you could find a way to integrate that more with market forces or integrate that more economically, that's probably a superior way, like both politically and everything else, than integrating it with like tax policy. Like if you have a corporation where, if we could imagine, we could just like print 50 years of history right away and people start someplace. If you have a cooperatively owned corporation and it just is that the CEO owns 10 times more than the bottom employee, and that's the most it ever is, then that's a norm that carries forward into the future, probably requires less intervention from the government to make things fair between the lowest paid employee and the highest paid employee, because that's just like a norm that would hopefully develop and stay in place over time. Whereas if you have the norms that we have today, and it's the thing, you don't have to fight as much for policy, for welfare, for UBI, whatever bullshit. Those conversations are hopefully just not as much what we talk about politically. Whereas in our system today, we have to have massive fights over redistribution of wealth. And in my opinion, people have a very fucked concept of where does wealth in this country come from, because people very much look at the top of the pyramid and they assume that the block is floating there rather than all of the piles of stuff that are beneath that help to support that structure. So in my opinion, like the greatest advantage to more cooperatively owned economies or socially owned economies is that there's so much more economic integration. You can eliminate a lot of these very lame and very morally loaded fiscal questions about how does the government steal money from rich people and give it back to poor people, because in a more socially owned economy, you can kind of see like, oh, actually, everybody is required to make this business work. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, gang, if you want to ask either of these lovely individuals some questions, if you have comments that you want to share, just jump backstage. We'll take a little bit of callers. It won't be too long. And then we'll wrap it up and we'll close out for the evening. I gotta say, I have more questions than I have answers, but that's probably limited to the format and the fact that we've gone for 2 hours and it's a whole ass economic system. So I don't think it's entirely fair to ask you to like answer every single question and all these things, but fair enough. Let's bring on some of these individuals and see what happens. Okay, you're live. Hello. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi. What you got for us?
Hello.
I wanted to ask Econoboy about his like morals and ideology, because he's said before that he's described himself as a liberal socialist, or at least that his socialism is compatible with liberalism. From everything I've read, liberalism, one of the core tenets of liberalism is private enterprise and private property. But in his ideal society, as I understand it, private property wouldn't exist and would be highly discouraged, maybe even not allowed by the state. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I referenced also in the beginning of this discussion multiple liberal thinkers who really didn't agree with that conception of liberalism, or at the very least, they thought it wasn't necessarily incompatible to have a socialist worldview, but also a liberal worldview. I think, J.S. Mill is a very well-known historical liberal thinker. He's not like right up there with like Locke and Hobbes and things like that, but he's pretty well-cited liberal, let's say historically, and he was a socialist at the end of his life. John Rawls, perhaps the most well-known liberal thinker contemporarily, certainly in political philosophy. He's probably the most famous political philosopher in our contemporary time. He was a liberal, but he also said that democratic socialism would establish his liberal ideals and his theory of justice. And so I think that it's important to understand that many liberals do advocate for private ownership of businesses. But it's not necessarily the case that you have to be a person who advocates for the private ownership of businesses to be a liberal, because being a liberal is much more complicated than that. Believing in individual rights, democratic frameworks, political egalitarianism. You can have all of those things and have entirely publicly owned businesses.
Okay. Any other questions for you, Raymond? Or we're going to cycle through these quick.
I was going to ask if private enterprise is not a priority, and I've seen you say that you wouldn't want too much, how should I say it, state oppression and state means to get rid of private property. You said that you don't want systems like the USSR and maybe China, but is there an acceptable increase into things like eminent domain and direct nationalization that you would be fine as compared to right now?
Yeah, again, so I think that there are probably moral and practical economic upper limits to how much you can socialize. I know that Destiny wanted to talk about kind of, let's just kind of skip to the end state and imagine how it would look like, which is totally fine. But I do think that it's probably sensible to say, hey, if we get to, and I said it, I think in my opening statement or near to it, if we get to a world where like 80% of businesses are publicly owned, and then all of a sudden you have this like 20% of businesses that are just like stubbornly not selling their shares, or it's just not a good investment to buy their shares, slash it would be like really bad for the economy to do so. I'm not really so offended by the idea of allowing some trivial level of private ownership in my society because
sorry.
we've gotten so
Sorry,
far.
I'm asking more like if you have the democratic mandate, the people come to you and say, bro, we want to get rid of private property, so we are increasing eminent domain by 10 times with this and this and this measure, or we are going to nationalize this and this industry, and you are like the prime minister or the president. Are you are your morals stopping you from going on that democratic mandate, or do you say, oh, I believe in democracy, so if the people want the expropriation of all capital, even though that's not my I want voluntary transactions, I will still support the involuntary transactions?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, whether you want to make me president or not, I would argue probably against that if it would require some like wild level of violence or militarism in our society. So if they wanted to vote me out, I guess they could. But like I said, based on my morals and kind of how bad I think the trivial level of private ownership left in society would be, I don't think it would be that big of a deal to wage essentially a war to socialize the remaining 20% if you had to do that.
Okay.
Also, can I just say real quick, because I see people saying this just as a quick thing. When Econoboy says private property, when we're talking about private property in the circumstances, we're just talking about like capital stuff. We're not talking about like
I try to say
homes and cars
businesses, just to be clear.
Yeah, I know, but I see some people are saying like, oh, he wants to take your house or your private property. When that's the distinguishing thing for socialists is usually private property versus personal property. Socialists don't want to take your personal property unless they're really good, I guess. But when they say private property, they mean like businesses and like revenue generating stuff. Is generally what people are talking about.
They're not going to take your PlayStation, gang. Okay, so
Yes,
Raymond, thanks for calling in.
Thanks.
Hello, you're live. Calling in.
Thanks.
Hello?
Hi, what you got?
Hello, how are you doing, sir?
Oh, what's
So
up?
I
Oh, this is the
have
guy. Oh my God, one of my
Who's the
biggest
guy?
fans. I finally get to meet you. How are you doing,
I
bro?
have a
Holy
question for
shit.
you, Destiny, okay?
Oh my
So,
God.
Destiny, why you're all politics? I feel like you defend capitalism.
I feel like I should mute for this particular caller, but maybe that's I don't know. Let's give him a chance.
What did he say? What was the question? Can you translate?
Are
for me,
you
Wade?
defending capitalism from spite because Hassan defends socialism?
Yes. How did you catch
Okay.
me? Fuck, you got me.
Okay.
Why don't
Thanks.
you answer seriously, huh?
Thanks for calling in, buddy.
And how old was Rose?
Older than your mom. I caught him.
The dangers of open call-ins. Okay. Let's try someone I actually know. Hello, you're live. Hello, you're live.
What's up? So I got a question for Econoboy. I do agree with the criticism that it seems like most of like the reasonableness in your system comes from that transitionary period where things aren't actually the system that you want. With how massive and impractical that transition even is, what is your qualm with just like having a broader social safety net and leaning more into like freer markets or like more protected markets like in Scandinavia than straight up socialized ownership of all profits?
Well, the problem is that these things are not incompatible, right? So you can expand welfare payments and also capitalize public holding corporations. And I think also one of the big things is that I don't think that this is very impractical, right? So again, I'm using Norway as an example, but I think there's reasons to think that the United States would have actually an easier time of socializing production than Norway, but Norway was able to, at this current present moment, able to up social ownership to something like 40 to 45% of GDP. And so I think that, we can go in that direction. That was only over the course of basically one generation, like 30 years or something like that. So, I mean, I think that certainly we could
stop.
do...
You can't keep answering that way. That's not fair. You're implying that Norway owns 40 to 50% of all their firms domestically, or has controlling shares in
I'm talking about, their GDP, Destiny. Like, I don't know if it really matters about like the individual. We're talking about like of all the shit that the Norwegians produce, something like 40 to 45% of it comes from collectively owned institutions. Obviously, in the United States, if we socialized one business that's way bigger than a bunch of smaller businesses, yeah, like in terms of like the number of entities we've socialized, I guess it's only 1 and not 100. But it's like of all the shit we actually produce.
If all that 40 to 50% is just the oil that they're making, or is just energy based, it's not really the same thing, right?
Like I said, in the United States, like the biggest corporations in the United States are things like tech companies and financial institutions. Those are publicly traded and easily socializable, right? So I mean, in theory, again, because we have such a robust capital market, we would be able to sort of do the same incremental type things that Norway has done, but just buy those things out on an open market instead of having to start our own individual state-owned enterprises like oil companies and mineral extraction businesses, right?
Listen, I think my issue with the conversation more so is that it's socialism versus capitalism, but capitalism hasn't even really gone on trial at all here. It's been more of just like kind of figuring out what your version of socialism is. And
yeah, but
I don't agree with
just to be clear,
healthcare.
Okay, figuring it out again. I think that my model is pretty fucking clear, okay? It's a bunch of different publicly... Wick, that's because you're a fucking dumbass, and you can't seem to understand anything that I'm saying, okay? Holy shit.
I might be a dumbass. That's true.
If you don't know what a sovereign wealth fund is or a holding corporation, that's
most of America,
cool, but,
right, these things...
Because I'm not trying to. We're just having a debate here. You guys keep saying, "Oh, it's so vague. I can't understand it."
It is.
It's a bunch of different holding corporations.
That's not the claim I'm making. Can I?
It's a claim I'm making, Jeptan. It's vague.
It's stupid.
Well, we have to go to the rules. Okay, what rules?
I wrote a 5,000
Yeah, but I'm
page
gonna
or
get kicked and
5,000
rotated
word.
out with somebody, so I just want to make my claim really quick because Wick, you'll be here the whole time. My claim is just. In the socialism versus capitalism conversation, we haven't actually compared socialism versus capitalism. We've just sort of allowed you to paint the perfect picture of socialism and compare it to the United States. But that doesn't really compare socialism versus capitalism because take a country like Singapore, I would say, even though I'm not supportive of like nationalized healthcare, they've shown the success of like largely extraordinarily free markets and socialization of like a few key things that people support.
They
like
literally have
healthcare.
Socialized the vast majority of wealth in their society with their public holding corporation and their sovereign wealth fund. I don't think that's just capitalism,
and nationalized
right?
healthcare, but their markets are not largely controlled. Like you as a person can own a business, can start a business, can raise private capital for that business. You don't need to go.
No, I agree. They're not a socialist country, okay? But the idea that Singapore is just this like perfect capitalist, utopia. It's not true. They have socialized with public ownership the vast majority of the wealth and business capital in their society with socialization of those means of production.
Of the government's wealth. But what I'm saying is
of all the wealth in society, in Singaporean society, that is.
What I'm saying is on the socialism versus capitalism side, I think you would agree Singapore is more on the capitalist side, and someone who is
by what metric?
Who is a proponent of by the metric of you have free flow of capital, you have the free ability to open a private business, raise private capital, hire private employees, and you're good to go there.
But in terms of all the shit that they produce and all the wealth they've accumulated, most of it's socially owned through public entities.
But the means of that production is not.
It's publicly owned. Yes, it is. You just don't know what you're saying. You don't know what Singapore. You just go fucking read a book. Jesus Christ.
Thank you for calling in.
So sick of having to explain. Go read about how Singapore organizes its fucking entities and its public wealth, and you tell me if that's just a bunch of capitalism. Like they have fucking collectively owned means of production.
To
and
be
calling
clear,
it capitalism.
under your system, I couldn't do what they do in Singapore, right? I couldn't go and open my own business.
So Wick, I'll explain it for the 20th time, okay? In my moral framework, we might get to a point where you'd have some wild need to do a revolution and expropriate all the landlords and capital. I wouldn't advocate for doing that if we landed there. Now, if we got... Yeah. Hey, Wick, again... In my ideal system, where we have total public ownership, it doesn't look exactly like Singapore. But I haven't called Singapore socialist. I've only said that they're not just capitalist, like dumbass Jeb is saying, and like you're trying to imply. Those are totally different statements, aren't they, Wick? Do you understand the difference?
What I am saying...
Do you understand the difference between those two statements?
I don't think you're addressing what I said at all.
Okay. All right.
my
Now,
problem-
Singapore is a socialist country. So is Norway.
I'm
That's what
not
I've meant the whole
arguing
time.
whether Singapore is socialist or capitalist. I'm not arguing that. That has nothing to do with what I'm saying. What I'm saying
Oh,
is,
fuck.
under the system that you have outlined,
Yeah.
I could not go and just start my own business. There would be many
Yes.
more roadblocks.
Socialism
than there
is different
currently
than
are.
Singapore because Singapore is not socialist. So when you bring up that, hey, Econoboy, your system doesn't look like Singapore, I agree. I'm only using Singapore as an example of what the transition would look like. Okay. And I think that's a very sensible way to understand, hey, if you want to see what the transition would look like, look at a country like Singapore
Whether
and Norway.
we want to do the transition or not, only matters based on where you want us to transition to. Whether or not I want to go through a transition at all, I have to know what we're transitioning to is better than what we have now.
And I've already admitted you don't know that.
Me.
I've already admitted you don't know that. One system isn't going to be the same as another. You got to take some risks, you know? I mean, goodness, obviously.
Yes.
No
Caller-
shit. Your ideal
Caller-
liberalism doesn't exist either. Your ideal tax code doesn't exist either. You got to make some leaps of logic, you know? Come on. Anyway,
Okay,
sample
look,
text.
yeah.
I've got a feeling I
What's
know
up?
what you're going to talk about, sample text.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Long time no talk, Econoboy. Well, by the way, the real take is that Singapore is socialist, and that's why it's underperforming relative to other people.
That's
in the same
right.
metrics.
That's right.
Okay. Either way, there. So I have two questions: one for Destiny, one for Econoboy. Econoboy can suspect what I'm going to ask about. Well, whatever. So for Destiny, Econoboy started the debate in his opening statement by making also a moral argument, about the inherent value that there is in egalitarianism, right, and equal distribution.
Not even Destiny can
income,
contend with Tiny Tim sample. Not even
that's right,
Destiny.
that's why we're gonna get the utilitarianism pill, whatever. And Destiny, I know you don't like talking about like normative ethics and meta ethics and all that, but like just I don't know, what would be your response to someone saying like there is this inherent value in equality and political equality?
When you say equality, I hate to do this, but if we're going to do more philosophy memes or whatever, when you say equality, what kind of equality are we talking about here? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, equality of outcome. So, imagine a society, Econoboy, what he would say, I'm a utilitarian, but whatever. Econoboy, what he would say is like, I'm going to give this broad take and then you tell me if you need to specify it, okay? So in my mind, in an ideal world, there is like a floor that hopefully nobody can go beneath. And if they do, then they are subsidized or compensated in some way such that they can have like whatever bare necessities we decide somebody is entitled to in society, given that they're at least putting in the bare minimum effort. And then that's basically what I'm looking for. I think that having some form of compensation in society that is matching the level of effort that you're putting in, I think is good. I think it's good to reward people that want to work hard and want to achieve more or whatever. I think it's fine that doctors get paid more than, less educated professions. I think that's okay. Yeah, broadly speaking. Right. But imagine, so yeah, it's called instrumental value. Like it helps in other respects, ensures a high quality of life. But imagine like you could have two societies that are equal in every other respect, just like one is more equal, the other isn't. Is that something you find inherently valuable as well, regardless of the outcomes it has on other things? That's a big thing that moved Econoboy. He read philosophers that made that point. He agreed, and that's why he said it as an ideal. So. No.
I think that when you say one is more equal and one isn't, you mean like in terms of like distribution of wealth in society?
Yeah, imagine like, so wealth is only a means to happiness, right? So imagine like, a society, one has
So this is the issue that I would say. I would like, I don't know how you want to answer this, but there's a ideal level and then there's like a practical level. I would say ideally, I don't think wealth inequality should matter that much at all. On a practical level, it seems like a lot of other people disagree though. And that's the thing that you do have to account for, that like wealth inequality in and of itself is like a massive predictor for a lot of social ills and social unrest. So like it might, so for instance, let's say you're asking me in one society, there's a guy with a super yacht and everybody else has, like their nice family homes, but they see the guy with the super yacht going up and down the fucking coast every day, right? And then in another society, everybody kind of lives in apartment buildings and nobody has the super yacht. I would say, well, I think that the society where one guy has the super yacht and everybody else has homes is probably a better society, but it seems to be the case that most people in society actually prefer the one where everybody's in the same kind of situation.
Right.
So I don't know what the actual answer is to that. I guess we have to do something to address wealth inequality as much as we can, because the perception of it, if we can't change the perception of it, then you have to do something with it. Otherwise, you elect people like Donald Trump.
Right, and the real red pill is actually inequality doesn't have all these negative consequences people say. So just for example, people can look up Revisiting the Income Inequality Crime Puzzle by Matteo Pizzona, I think that's his name, and it's a paper, basically meta-analysis, like saying, actually, no, whatever. Either way, that's to me. So for Econoboy, just very quickly, so,
Yes.
Destiny made the point that, like, your system might be equivalent to a system with like a really, really high corporate income tax and whatever, and you made the point, well, no, actually, corporate profits are also, like, they eat into new investments. And you and I, we both talked about this before, but like that's not the case when you tax cash flow. That there's a tax called the destination-based cash flow tax that doesn't have this problem. It just taxes cash flows, which is what represents the value of a stock and what goes to shareholders. So how's your system, Econoboy, different than a system that has just a really high DBCFT, destination-based cash flow tax, that finances the UEI? How is it different?
Yeah. So my system is different because, number one, you would need an efficient tax code in my system. So my system wouldn't get rid of all forms of efficient taxation. But then number two, it's different because the actual stock of wealth, like the accumulated wealth of society, would be publicly owned instead of privately owned. And that's a point that I also made to Dusty, not just like the taxes would be inefficient in his system, practically speaking, but then also that the actual stock of wealth in society would still be privately owned and not publicly owned, which I think for egalitarian and sort of downstream reasons is just strictly worse.
Okay,
but
thank you.
Yeah, but okay. If you want to end it here, whatever.
Thank you.
So wait, real quick, just add on this real quick. Like society, it doesn't really matter who owns the wealth, right? Like the wealth in and of itself, we don't really care about. It's more the fact that wealth begets more wealth and that it generates something. So we really care about like the profits generated by wealth, right?
Yeah. And before I go, I'll just make the point that you do own the wealth, quote unquote, but I said finance it with the UBI, so it's directly taking capital rents and horizontally distributing them equally to everyone with the UBI, right? So there is horizontal sharing here, but whatever, that's okay. You guys can talk.
You can address Destiny's point if you like. And then
Sorry,
what
was
paid
your
me
point,
to ask
Destiny?
questions.
My bad.
Well, you keep saying that like it's good for society to own the wealth versus private people to own the wealth, but like really the whole the only reason we really care about wealth is because it generates profits generally, right?
Well, yeah, and there's also, I mean, there's, you can leverage your wealth, and you said wealth begets wealth, all the various ways that capital can accumulate, right? So that's one reason. But again, I think there are strict egalitarian reasons to say that wealth accumulation in the private hands is not preferable, right? That, people who are wealthier, I don't think relate to average people the way that other average people relate to average people, because there's this kind of like built-in elitism to society. I think that oftentimes wealth also has the downstream effect of being very toxic for your democratic institutions, right? Like we saw that with Elon Musk. Like under my system, people would still be rich, but like if the richest person in society was worth $100 million, you wouldn't be able to buy an entire social media network and propagandize to a population. You wouldn't be able to pay for an entire presidential campaign by yourself, right? So those are the kind of things that I'm concerned about when it comes to this great degree of wealth inequality.
Okay. A couple people paid me money to ask some questions, so I will.
All right.
$5 from Apex.
They paid you money instead of donating to charity. Interesting. Curious.
I am charity. I'm poor. Okay.
If
Econoboy would drop the hard money constraints and just call himself post-Keynesian or neo-Keynesian, I know what you're talking about. I don't know how to pronounce it. We could move on to fighting fascists again. Not really a question, but thank you for the $5. $7 from Charlie Charios to say, Econoboy seems to be focused on publicly listed companies. 87% of U.S. companies with revenue greater than 100 million are private. How would they function?
So yeah, again, so these public holding corporations, I do focus on the publicly listed ones because those are just the easiest to buy. But these publicly owned corporations, these publicly owned holding corporations would engage in all sorts of entrepreneurial investment. So that might include buying out public companies as well, or offering capital to public or private companies as well, and offering capital to private companies. And so private companies could also be like publicly owned. Again, they would just be publicly owned, but not traded on a public stock exchange. So that's totally compatible with my model.
Okay. 10
pounds.
And
I was going to say, it's also important to note that if the Fed has this distribution of financial accounts, right, where they explain this. And even though there's a lot more private companies, the actual value of those private companies is several orders of magnitude less than the value of public companies, which is kind of interesting to think about.
10 pounds for Maze to say, ask Econoboy how he determines if a fund is good. And will the FAMA French 5 factor still hold in his system? Also, I believe active managed funds fail to beat the market 80% of the time.
Yeah. So just because actively managed funds fail to beat the market doesn't mean that the process of active management is bad for capital allocation, right? So we would typically say that it's more allocatively efficient to have a competitive active process than to just have a much smaller minority of people doing substantially the same process. When it comes to your first question about how do you determine like which holding corporations are doing the best, well, it'd be similar to our current system where it would be like who's actually maximizing the value of their portfolio the best, who's returning the most capital to the shareholders, which would be the state. And that would be like the triggers for their performance-based compensation as well. To your third question about the 5 factor, I guess I just don't know what that is, so I'm not sure.
On a French 5 factor, I'm not sure what that is either. So
you guys don't know about the formula French 5? Oh my god!
It's been a while since I've been to grad school, so I think.
My god.
Yeah. Just not sure.
$10 from Lawson Harrison to say, Econo Boy, my hatred of your ideal system is matched only by my love of you personally. $2 from Blaine's Escape Corner to say, sole prop doesn't mean one person, you can have workers. 30, some sort of currency, says, I foresee extreme brain drain in the future of this system. Skilled people will just move.
Who said the sole proprietor doesn't mean you can have employees? How do you have a W-2 employee in a sole proprietor structure? Can you issue W-2s as an individual? I feel like don't you need an LLC for that?
Yeah, I don't really think a sole proprietor. I don't think you would call like a guy who owns 100% of a small company like a sole proprietor. But maybe you would. I don't know. But when I say sole proprietor, when I say sole proprietor, I mean like one guy doing a business, not one person owning a business. So but I think that was clear in the debate. So
30. This currency to say, I foresee extreme brain drain in the future. Brain drain in the future of this system. Skilled people will just move to countries that will allow them to be paid more and hold capital.
Yeah, I mean, again, in my system, more skilled employees are paid more than other people, right? So there is a question, an open question as to like, and we talked about in the debate of like, how much does the prospect of capital ownership incentivize people to work and do productive things? And I mean, there's only so much evidence to say one way or another, right? But I'll just say like,
I wouldn't do this for free.
Well, but
I wouldn't hold these debates for free.
Well, right, but I mean, you might do it if you were just paid a lot of money by some other company to do it, right? So I mean, it's not necessarily the case that we wouldn't have like people do entrepreneurial investing just because they don't have the prospect of ownership. They would still have the prospect of performance-based pay and just like high pay scales in general. And so like that's to me, kind of a big thing. Again, like that's why I kind of ground my example in to a lot of the billionaires who tell their stories. They start out with like really a much smaller amount of capital, and like their original like that sort of like times zero entrepreneurial activity was done with a much smaller amount of capital than obviously the amount of capital that they've been able to accumulate on account of their ownership over time, right? So that's why I say like, hey, for a number of reasons, my system I think would in many respects be more entrepreneurial.
Gotcha. 200 Norwegian crowns to say, here Wick, hope this helps with the headache. These are capitalist Norwegian crowns. Don't let anyone say different.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's right.
$10 from Andrew Steele to say, socialism removes all personal incentive to perform better. That's the core problem. It throws away the incentive structure that works in the real world.
That's
People
right.
want to own their own stuff and time.
We certainly didn't just have a 2-hour discussion of how I to a pretty specific degree incentivize people to do more and do productive things. But I guess if, what's the reading comprehension equivalent to watching videos? This guy doesn't have good, like, I guess listening comprehension would be the word. I mean, just go back and watch the fucking VOD where, just go back and watch the VOD where I spoke just so much about how you incentivize people to do like entrepreneurial activity and like, why would people work more under your system? Well, because they get paid more. Like, what the fuck? Like, that seems like a pretty clear answer. So
$5 from Noonian Star to say Econo Boy has succeeded in renaming his bureaucratic capitalist pipe dream of his own as socialism.
That's right. Capitalism is when my system where all the capital is publicly owned is just capitalism. Capitalism where everything's publicly owned is just capitalism. I hear this from so many really big-brained people. It's not socialism. It's just capitalism where everything's socially owned. That's a new one for me personally. Just, make that one make sense, guys.
Well, to make it make sense, the argument would be that there are workers who are producing a disproportionate amount of stuff and a disproportionate amount of their surplus values being taken by the state and redistributed to other workers. So it's more of a state capitalist model than a socialist model because you don't actually own your labor and you're alienated from it the same way you would be in a capitalist system.
That's the Marxist conception of socialism. But again, the broadest umbrella of socialism is just collective ownership of the means of production. Look, ultimately, if you guys out there want to call my system capitalism, fine. But if you're not calling it bad, I don't really care that much about the label, personally. I just think it happens to be socialism.
It's a collective ownership of the means of production. There is no collective ownership of the means of production, though, in your system, right? It's the government owns the means of production.
Social ownership, the people, the public.
But it's the government. It's a state-owned enterprise. SOE is a state-owned enterprise, not socially owned enterprise,
just
right?
Just because the state is managing it, just because you're outsourcing the management of that capital, doesn't mean you don't own it. Similar to how you mentioned how just because Vanguard is allocating your capital doesn't mean you don't own that capital.
No, but I can sell my shares on Vanguard. I can't sell my shares in a state-owned enterprise.
Yeah, but I just don't think that's a more meaningful I don't think that's like a more meaningful way to understand like public ownership. And as well, when you talk about corporate, when you talk about
I'm saying that like if you had a doctor working at a place, he's producing a great deal more of his surplus values being taken from him, right? Exploited, and then it's being given to the state that's then redistributing it to it. So he's still alienated from his labor. He still doesn't have the ownership of the goods and services he's producing for society.
If you have a Marxist conception of socialism or just like this kind of like labor theory of value kind of conception of socialism, then of course my system is not socialism. But again, like I just think it's kind of brain dead to say like my system is just capitalism when my system has essentially entirely collectively owned means of production, right? I think that's at least at the very least we could say that to the extent that a socialist system is the decommodification of labor and socialization of ownership, my system is at least a socialist project, a socialist step in the socialist direction. But to call it just capitalism,
you say decommodification of labor, but labor is still just as commodified. You said you would pay different people different amounts based on the work they do, right?
Right. But again, like to the extent that you need social ownership and decommodification, at least the social ownership part is a step towards socialism, and it's not just
you don't have
capitalism.
Social ownership. Right? It's just state-owned enterprises. There's no social ownership. It's just owned by the state.
So again, right. I think that you can call my system ownership because it's public ownership. Many like democratic socialists in history have had a conception of social ownership where the state would essentially nationalize industries. And, look, again, if people have a semantic disagreement about like, no, it has to be like individual accounts or it has to be like essentially worker ownership in some way, like transferable worker ownership, then I don't know.
Would you say like in China, would you consider that like social ownership, the stuff that the CCP has?
Well, that's what I would call state ownership because they don't have a democratic system, right? So, I mean, in terms of how you're accessing the wealth, it's hard to say that the average Chinese person has meaningful access to public wealth because they literally don't. Like, they don't vote on what to do with public wealth. But in a democratic system, you do vote. Like, you vote on managers of public wealth.
Well, no, because it wouldn't be voted. It would be held with by the technocrats that are managing the holding companies, right?
So that's my recommendation for how to manage public wealth. But obviously, society at large is determining how to manage it. So similarly to how, again, if I say I want my wealth to be managed in a passive way, or I want my wealth to be managed by some other firm doing the actual allocation, that doesn't mean I don't own it, right? So I think that the democratic nature of my ownership is what makes it like social ownership relative to China. You've made the point about individual accounts being a big difference, but I don't happen to think that that's that big of a difference personally.
Okay. $5 from Metal Rules to say, Econoboy, you gave the Norway example, but their sovereign fund is barred from investing in their domestic companies. But you want to do the opposite here?
Jeez. You're right. We didn't talk about that in this discussion. We never talked about that. That wasn't a thing that we brought up. So
I'm reading.
No, I know. I've only answered 100 questions the same way 100 times. So I do understand they have two different sovereign wealth funds. One of them is invested in the domestic economy, which is several times small. It's like 5 or 6 times smaller than the other one. That's the big boy, also known as the oil fund, which is invested in foreign capital. So I'll repeat myself, okay? And Wick, you're making me do this because your goddamn audience member didn't hear me the first time, okay? I happen to think that the U.S., because it has a much bigger financialization of capital and financial market, would have an easier time using a sovereign wealth fund to establish social ownership because so many more valuable domestically owned companies are traded on the U.S. stock exchange. The Oslo Stock Exchange is very small because it's literally just a very, very small, not very diversified economy, right? So, that's the answer again. Go back and watch it a second time if you want.
Or $10 from Cameron Swan. to say, Destiny, do you think the criticism of socialism has never worked in the past is fair, given that the same critique was used against founders creating a constitutional democratic republic for the first time?
No, I don't think you can say just because something hasn't worked, it won't work in the future. That's as stupid as saying just because new things have worked in the past that every new thing will work in the future, right? Generally, when I bring that argument out, usually it's to address the fact that like it's very frustrating to have to deal with all the messy realities of your implementation of your current system, and then to pretend like that's being compared to the like nirvana of some other systems. Usually, I'll say that, but I never dismiss. Like I haven't said over and over again to Econoboy, oh, well, your system is hypothetical and idealized, right? I'm trying to attack it on grounds that I think have substance in terms of how would you allocate capital, what would profits look like, what would other things like. I'm making substantive attacks. So if you've heard this entire conversation and you think it's just me saying, well, this hasn't worked in the past, so therefore it won't work in the future, like you're not paying attention, number one. Number two, when you look at how people were designing the U.S. government, you are so unbelievably historically illiterate if you think that this was just a random shot in the dark. If you go through the Federalist Papers, they are constantly considering prior forms of governance. They are drawing on so much, in discussions of do we have a single executive or a double executive. When they talk about the whole legal framework was borrowed from the common law system, the whole concept of the Magna Carta and even the king has to answer to some kind of like legal authority. Like all of these things are drawn upon to create the framework that eventually was the United States of America. So to pretend that that was like just a shot in the dark or something, it's like, oh, well, they never tried it before and now they're going to try it for the first time. It's like, and they knew also that was one of the big things that they admitted in the beginning, that this was a radical new experiment and a radical new thing. Like that was conceded at the time. I think even Abe Lincoln said that the main purpose of the Civil War was like to hold the Union together. I think he said if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do so. So like, yeah, I don't think that statement is anywhere near the own the guy thought it was, but thanks.
Fair enough. $5 to Scorn One to say, even if his system is feasible, is it really that much better than if we just put in a little more regulation or work into what we already have? And his in this context is Econoboy. It's like, yeah, why revamp or rehaul when we could just iterate?
So again, I do advocate for iteration and incrementalism. So I do advocate, we didn't talk about this, we wanted to keep it in the ideal system. But I do obviously advocate for a methodical transition where we take a lot of these private assets and slowly socialize them over time. That is what I believe in. That's one of the reasons why I reference places like Singapore and Norway, not because they're socialist ideals, but because they are at least examples of countries that have engaged in this process of socialization. And I think at the very least, we could say that in that process of socialization, they've done a lot of good for their people.
Okay. £10 from Jacob Buckingham to ask, what are Destiny and Econoboy's thoughts on Georgism?
I think it's based.
It seems okay. I don't have strong thoughts on it, but...
Fair. $5 from AKA Batozai. So he doesn't know how it's going to help others, but he knows it's going to hurt billionaires. Blinks Magnus for $10 says, Econoboy, saw you change the flags in your background. I'm sure the Soviet flag was tongue-in-cheek. I'm just curious if you'd put a swastika behind you if Destiny called you a Nazi.
Like Destiny said, you can't buy a swastika on Amazon, and that's probably because, just generally speaking, my instinct, I think Hutch said the same thing when he talked to Wick, is that the swastika is considered a much more evil and generally offensive thing than a hammer and sickle. A lot of people have hammer and sickles even today, so... I don't know.
Should it be? That's a question. We might debate that sometime. Ryan, $5. Econoboy says that in transition, we can get more and more public ownership. How easy is it for private investment to crowd out public or transition back?
Good God, read that again. I'm sorry. Go for it.
What he's asking basically is, say you're going on there, you're transitioning to your system, and there hits a point where you're like, oh shit, we've made everything worse. What's the mechanism to retransition, to detransition, if you want to?
You would just privatize public assets? That's all you would do?
Okay. Shaved Dog's Ass for $10 to say, it sounds like Econoboy, as much as he wants to avoid it, basically wants state capitalist Chinese-style markets, but with rule of law as a focus rather than party rule.
That's right. My system is just capitalism, guys. Never forget. Keep going.
$5 from Prismagic to say, Econoboy, chill on the smugness. People aren't dumb because they don't understand. You're a terrible communicator that can't explain unautistically.
Sure. Yeah, the guys who asked questions that I directly spoke about in the course of the debate, of course, it's me that has the problem communicating. I admit, look, I'm not the best communicator on the planet, but it does get a little bit frustrating when people you have thousands of people that are Econoboy, your system's just capitalism. I don't understand how it's socialism. Answered 1,000 times in 1,000 different mediums. This literally started out with me writing a whole 3-part article series fully explaining my exact transition, right? Well, the 5,000 words was just the third part, right? It takes 30 minutes to read, right? And people are like, I don't understand it. How does it? I don't get it. And it's like, goddamn, I literally spelled it out. Like I it's like I read The Public Wealth of Nations and copied a lot of that stuff over. Like I read that book and was able to understand it. I don't think I'm using fundamentally different fucking grammar than the guy. Like shit, I don't think I'm the smartest guy in the world either. But shit, guys.
$5 from Blaine's Escape Corner to say, do you think if you keep answering the same questions with the same answers, you might suck at answering? Communication is on you to explain better.
I don't think
and
so.
Then finally,
okay. I thought I was supposed to answer.
100 Norwegian crowns to say, I'm so tired of hearing socialists use my country as a lube to sneak in socialism.
That's
also,
right.
we don't have 2 wealth funds.
Okay, so number one, you do. This is another fun example of Norwegians saying, I'm Norwegian, and I happen to understand that my economy is not socialist. Oh, by the way, we only have one wealth. No, you have the Global Pension Fund Global, and you have the Global Pension Fund Norway. Those are 2 different sovereign wealth funds that you luckily have access to as a Norwegian citizen. If you don't understand your own country, that's fine, but don't say you do just because you happen to be from there. I'm from America, and I think Desi and Wick would agree, there's a lot of Americans that don't know shit about shit when it comes to America, okay? That's one of the problems we might have in a fundamental sense, right? So come on, guys, let's just, let's be real here.
And with that, ladies and
gentlemen. I debated a lot of people from the UK who didn't know that they voted on their members of European Parliament.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming, gang. I'm going to give each of you closing statements and tell people where they can find you. I have a link to Econoboy's Substack if you would rather read than listen. You can find the answers to your questions there. We're going to give the mic first to Destiny, and then we're going to let Econoboy have the last word. So go ahead, Destiny, close us out.
Yeah, I think Econoboy just wants capital. No, I'm just kidding. I'm half king. I feel like when people talk about, when people talk about socialism in its like most hardcore form, I think we're usually talking about like means and mode of production. So we're getting rid of private ownership, which means you don't have individuals making decisions about which businesses to start. You don't have an owner class that's extracting value from laborers, and then you're changing your mode of production such that like you're not responding to market incentives anymore. Like there's a central committee that's telling you what to make. Obviously, there are huge criticisms with both of these things. But I feel like a lot of this kind of socialism light or softer socialism that gets suggested today tries to avoid both of these things by introducing either capitalistic elements in terms of how firms are ran or market forces that are still working. And then they try to substitute out basically like investors or capital owners for these quasi-state managed enterprises. And I do feel like we're essentially kind of like recreating capitalism, and we're trying very, very, very desperately to salvage all the pros of capitalism while getting rid of the cons, which I'm actually like in concept, I'm actually okay with that. I think we should try to salvage good things and get rid of bad things from systems rather than get rid of the thing itself. I feel like it's not really related to this debate, but I really do feel like it sucks, but I feel like solving a lot of the wealth inequality today in the United States, I think is actually incredibly fucking easy. It's just very politically unpopular. I think that, and maybe even Econoboy would agree, I think that if you were to literally bump up like all of the tax brackets by like 5 to 8 points, and bump up like your capital gains by like 20 to 25 points, I would be surprised if there was this massive exodus of wealth, if there was this massive destruction of the economy. I think that you would raise on the order of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in order to do more projects. And I think the country would truck along just fine. And I feel like this is just a way better approach to things than to try to like radically redesign the entire economy. A lot of what we talked about today was kind of like the hypothetical way we would do this domestically, but we didn't even really scratch the surface of what does it look like internationally. And if you remember, like one of the biggest criticisms of capitalists when they say, well, didn't all the socialist economies fail? Other people just say, oh, well, that's because capitalist economies killed them all. And it's like, okay, well, why wouldn't that happen again? Would all the capital investment just go to Canada or Mexico? Yeah, but I mean, I guess in a way, this debate is kind of like the reverse of how it normally goes. Generally, the socialist gets to critique the capitalist constantly, and the socialist has like their perfect system, and then the capitalist to see what the best realities of their system. But in this debate, the tables are kind of turned, so it's harder for Econoboy because I'm basically just getting to launch like a massive internal critique, which is challenging. You're asking somebody to solve a whole bunch of different problems that can might manifest in a bunch of different ways, and then I can always retreat behind the curtain of saying, well, my economy works right now, doesn't it? So fuck you. So it makes it a little bit easier from my perspective, but yeah, that's that's largely my thoughts on that.
Thanks for being here. And I did ask him the question of how this would work internationally, but he didn't like that question. And
well, I did answer it directly, but maybe it was too confusing an answer.
It might have been too confusing for me, but
I did literally say exactly how that would work, but goddamn, I do use fucking really I'm just a dumb communicator, I guess. What can I say, guys? But anyway, yeah, my final statement, guys. So, I mean, look, I think that fundamentally we were stuck in kind of our ideal framework for a long time with this debate, and that's totally fine. But I think that part of the reason for that is, I don't know if it's strategic on Dusty's part, or it's just like, that's just kind of like, we want to talk about ideal socialism versus like current existing capitalism, which is fine. But I think at the very least, the transitionary stage is very hard to argue against, right? Like that we do actually have a ton of examples, like to the extent that we don't have examples of, like actually existing ideal socialism, of course I would agree with that. But we do have examples of actually existing transitions of private ownership of the means of production to social ownership of the means of production. We do know what it looks like for a company or for countries to open up public holding corporations. We do know what it looks like for countries to have sovereign wealth funds. There's hundreds of thousands of examples of these different entities across time and across countries, across cultures, across stages of development. And we, to that extent, we do know what makes them work and what makes them not work. And so to a large degree, that was what the third part of my Substack on how I became a socialist was trying to kind of surmise, was what makes public wealth work and what are the good things about public wealth. Insofar as public wealth and the transition to accumulating public wealth can work, it's good because it greatly horizontalizes the wealth of society, makes overall society to be much more egalitarian. And I think that there's also reason to believe that insofar as basically public wealth is horizontally owned, then the capital income from that wealth is able to also be used by the state for some kind of public purpose. We reduce the need to use distortionary taxes. And I think that that's a reason that, especially at the very, very, very least, that in transition to our system, ideal social ownership, we would absolutely prefer the transition to just what we currently have now. Because what we currently have now is a system that is radically unequal, is, I think, radically unfair in many ways. And at the very least, if we just started accumulating some level of public wealth, similar to how these other societies that I've referenced have done, then that's to the extent that our system would be some level better than it is now. And although, like Destiny said, it's hard to defend like an unrealized ideal, I think it's very, very easy to defend at least a radical transitionary process to where we get to some like very high level of public ownership, to where maybe we end up hitting that kind of upper limit. And apologies for, I guess, being smug and being an asshole at some parts of this debate. It is a little frustrating to get asked the same question basically 1,000 times and to have answered that question within the very same conversation, and then to be asked again that very same question. I don't claim to be the best communicator, but I mean, when I talk to just people in my personal life and when I talk to people, just generally speaking, it just, I don't know, like it just seems like this is kind of an understandable thing. And it's hard for, I guess, everyone to understand it. And I'm not saying people that don't understand it are just like stupid, but I guess to some degree it is just like difficult to wrap your head around what kind of a radical transition of our economy would look like. And so just try to read the words that I write and hear the words that I say, and try to, reconcile that with our current system and come up with critiques yourself, to try and kind of refine what you imagine a good economic system would look like.
Okay, with that, we're going to let you guys go. I am still going to stream for a little bit. I have some thoughts of my own, but thank you again for coming, Destiny and Conaboy, and I hope to see you again in the future. Have a great day.
Bye, guys. Well, there it was. There was my discussion. Hold on. Zoom out a little bit. I'm a little too zoomed in. Guys, I'll be honest, very frustrating conversation in a number of ways, okay? Like, I just, people are like, I don't understand it. I don't understand it. And it's like, there's like, I don't know what's not understandable. Like I'm autistic. I'm autistic and can't fucking explain it, like, I don't know, like what, I just don't know what else I could possibly say. You know what I mean? Like, guys, very frustrating. It's like, oh, I didn't understand, how the system would work. I don't understand it's like, what do you not understand? The government, like Norway, has a sovereign wealth fund. It accumulates that capital. Then a committee of some like appointed bureaucrats and professionals says, hey, We need to split that off into separate holding corporations. How do those holding corporations work? Well, they work a lot like Vanguard and BlackRock, where they have a whole bunch of capital that they need to allocate in ways that maximize value. They could do that by buying businesses, investing in real estate, doing development activities. Where do the boards from those holding corporations come from? They would be appointed in a rules-based process, probably by some committee that's, formed by the public, right? Similar to how we have the Federal Reserve, and I referenced that, and they have a chair structure, and we have a rules-based process for appointing those people. Seems to work out pretty well, right? I don't understand. How does it work? It's just fucking, I don't get it. It's like, what's there not to get? Fuck. Guys, am I fucking losing it? That's all. Am I speaking a different language? Do those words just not make sense, And then at the Q&A, I get fucking smug fucking people that are like, "Mate, this stupid ass Econo boy doesn't even know Norway only has one sovereign wealth fund. It has two of them. Let me Google that for you. Hold on. Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, global pension fund of Norway, global pension fund of, it's global pension fund global. Oh my God. You've got two different sovereign wealth funds, Let me see if I can find, there's a direct state report that literally lists out the different assets. Here we go. The government pension fund. Here we go. The government fund, and I hope that we just have, here, where is it? Not the investment strategy. Just give me, here we go, market value, okay? Got the market value of the government pension fund. Okay, government pension fund of Norway is this, and let me see if I can find, so not this, but where is it? Where's the other one? Government pension fund Norway economy. This information, I don't think of this information as that hard to find, right? Goodness. And I'm gonna be fucking stubborn, and I don't care how long this takes, okay? I will find it. All investments. Okay, this is the big boy fund again. I refuse to, here we go. GFPN, here we go. Well, this page is taking a while to load. Give me 1 second, guys. I'm not moving on until we find this, goddammit. Because I don't think it's that hard to find. Oh, for some reason my internet's not here. Government Pension Fund Norway. History of finance with natural resources. GC. It's so sad that they have to do private shit talking session because they couldn't respond. I don't know. I don't know. If Wick wants to say I was acting like an asshole, it's like, I don't know, try to fucking, try to understand where I'm coming from at the very least, It is just very, frustrating. I don't know. I'm trying to find it, but it's hard to find it and talk to you guys at the same time. Dude, imagine it's actually hard to find. Dude, it's not that hard to find. I just haven't researched this in a while. Man. What a frustrating conversation in a number of ways. But I think I know how to find it, actually. Here we go. Investopedia. I found it. I don't know why this is an incognito window? Maybe that's why. All right, here we go. React, I found it. What is the Government Pension Fund of Norway? The Government Pension Fund of Norway is made up of two separate Norwegian investment funds with different mandates. The first is the Government Pension Fund Global, also known as the Oil Fund. The second is the Government Pension Fund of Norway, established in 1967 as something of a national insurance fund. It is smaller than the Oil Fund. There's two separate investment funds, right? Anyway, and I don't know. It took me 10 minutes to, not even, it took me 5 minutes to find that, man. Goddamn. Again, a lot of respect for you, but I do think your ego is still very proud. Look, obviously, I'm very upset by like Wick constantly telling me, oh my goodness, I just don't understand. It's like, well, Wick, like he's like laughing and giggling about like, oh well, he can't explain it. He's being so vague. It's like I'm not being vague. Like I'm being as specific as I can. I don't know. It's like, what am I supposed to do? Is that warning real? No idea. The wiki says it too. Yeah, I'm not surprised. But, whoa, that sounds like there are two. Whoa, Doobie, you're right. Well, guys, I don't know. Anything else you want to talk about? Is there anything you guys didn't understand that I should explain? Dude, I don't have the patience of a saint, man. I'm very impatient at this point. It is very frustrating when, fuck, like, I do feel like I explained this as flatly as I could, you know what I mean? And it's, I guess, like I said, I'm autistic. I have trouble explaining things. I'm socially awkward. Like, fuck, maybe. Big Destiny fan, I think he did a great job. His chat was pretty loose in a way that was surprising me. What do you feel that Destiny was fundamentally missing about your point? I don't know, man. The DGG guys have been, I don't know. They've been, I don't know. I think it's a loud minority, I guess, but what can I say? Can I ask you, have you ever talked to a Norwegian or Nordic person about your views? Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm friends with Joachim on Twitter, and he's a socialist. I don't know. I mean, I probably talked to lefty Norwegians and lefty people as well. Wick didn't know that shareholders appoint the board of directors on current companies. I don't know if he didn't know that, but it's just, I guess to a certain extent our system is complicated, but damn, fuck. Nice job, E-Boy. Thank you so much, guys. Remember to donate. All this money's going to charity, so if I was going to be frustrated, might as well be frustrated for a good cause. I'll probably end the stream somewhat soon, so if you were going to donate, be sure to donate in the next, 10 minutes or something like that. I have a question. How much capital is owned by a small business? They do a lot of econ activity, but that's not capital. I have a, sorry, how much is owned by small businesses? Oh, by small businesses, I mean, yeah, again, by the number of entities, it's a huge number of entities, but in terms of the value of those businesses, it's very small compared to large businesses. How much are you going to charge for that lecture? I thought it was supposed to be a debate. Listen, Direful, it's free, but you are encouraged to donate to charity. So, Boy, so you can start a business with personal private investor and sovereign wealth fund capital. You could do that again in the transition. You could do that. I agree with your views, but why? That's a good question. I don't know. Drizzle Drain, thanks for the donation. Keep up the good work. EB, thank you so much. Brother, sister, whatever. Yeah, typically when someone doesn't understand something, they giggle and scoff. Yeah, I don't know. It's frustrating. It's like Jeb who comes in and says like, oh, like Singapore was built. Like people make this point to me and it's like, dude, have I not responded to this point 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways? Singapore wasn't built because of publicly owned capital. It was built because of all the private capital market allocation. It's like, I'm not saying Singapore is my ideal system. I'm just saying they're an example of a system that's done a lot more of the socialization as a transitionary step than many other countries, and it seems like it's worked out pretty well for them. So when people are like, Norway's just capitalist, it's just a capitalist country that owns most of its wealth publicly. Singapore's just a capitalist country that does the same thing. It's like, it's not just capitalist, right? Come on. Let's see. Anyway, end of the day, all we want is the best outcomes for most people. It's just a matter of convincing other people. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, goodness. I think a lot of people have an emotional aversion to everything that even sounds like socialism or communism, so that's a bit of a wall that you need to get through. And it's impenetrable. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that Destiny's cultivated a community of generally, I guess, very anti-socialist people, but I don't know. I just, I feel like I answered all of his questions. He just kept saying my answers were unsatisfying, and I tried to be like, well, you just explain, like, what am I not answering? And he's like, it's vague, and it's like, what's vague about we would have a committee to determine who would go on the boards? He says, I don't want you to lay out every single rule. And it's like, okay, well, then we'd have a committee that would determine who would go on these boards, that would also determine like when to spin off other holding corporations, and then those holding corporations would act just like other private industry or private capitalist industries do today, right? What's vague about that? I don't know what's not understandable about that, Very frustrating. Norway does explicitly consider itself capitalist, but I don't know if that's in their constitution or something. I mean, I don't know, but I can tell you there's a lot of Norwegian socialists. There's a lot of Norwegian social democrats. And I don't know that they would just say like, oh, just like we're a capitalist country. Maybe some of them would, right? But again, I just happen to disagree. Like, I don't think, oh, just because you're Norwegian, you understand how the economy works. Like, no, like I've studied economics. Like it's complicated, I guess, you know? I think you need to give far more specific examples for some of the points. The Substack was a far better point of this. The tax part is far better understood in the Substack. Well, yeah, but again, I tried to ground it in, I did. Like I used the example of like opening up a shoe company or an oil field services company, or, you know, what would you do with all the real estate in the portfolio? It's like, well, like Destiny said, my answer was vague on that. It's like, how would you turn this real estate into cash? What would you do? You would just sell it. You would sell it. Like, how is that not understandable? You know? If a company has a bunch of real estate on its balance sheet that it wants to sell, it just sells it. Like, you know? Goodness. I think it would be beneficial to challenge Wick or Destiny on their long-term solution to deal with the issues of capitalism. That they just, I don't know. Well, like Destiny and Wick, I don't think have a great. I mean, I guess Wick and Destiny said that inequality just isn't that important, and they would say they would just use taxes. But then I said, well, it seems like a lot of the taxes that we would use are highly inefficient. At least we have reason to think that would be like bad for the economy relative to just like voluntarily distributed dividend payments. But there's not really an answer to that, right? Like Destiny tried to say it was the same thing as a corporate tax. I explained it's totally not the same thing as a corporate tax. Destiny says, okay, well, you know, to the extent that it's, you know, to the like we don't have a reason to think that your ideal system is actually workable. It's like, well, you know, we have reason to think that the transition at least looks pretty good. Never got a great response to that. And we do have reason to think that a whole shitload of wealth and capital income taxes are really bad for the economy, right? So, I mean, it's like we have reason to think that the currently existing system is inefficient in a number of ways. We have a lot of reason to think that the transition to my system, at the very least, would be beneficial in a lot of ways. And I agree, we don't have a roadmap of exactly what the socialist ideal looks like, but insofar as at the very least we can agree that the transition to the socialist system makes sense, then let's just start doing it and just, you know, see how it turns out once you get to a certain high level of public ownership, you know? I think that unfortunately in the court of public opinion, or even to sway people like Destiny, it might be advantageous to build out a model more thoroughly with like econ PhDs. I mean, yeah, like I'm not going to write a 500-page book or anything like that. I mean, I'm not going to write fucking, you know, Capital by Econoboy, fucking, you know, but maybe one day, I guess. But, you know, it's a tough one. But a few years ago, Destiny said he's not dogmatically devoted to any system. He's down for incremental changes to capitalism. Well, no, I tried to get Destiny to like concede that, hey, like, you've endorsed a sovereign wealth fund before, you know, let's just agree. Can we at least agree on like, let's start a sovereign wealth fund and then, you know, build it up and just kind of see how that works out. But he seemed hesitant to, you know, agree to that in my conversation. But let's see. Matt Bruning actually goes far into how a sovereign wealth fund is formed in specific tax parlance, but debate is pretty bad at bringing that to light. I gave 3 very clear ways that you would fund and initially capitalize these funds. I literally, like, I have 3 ways that you would start these funds. Number 1, just general tax revenue. Number 2, quantitative easing. Number 3, just organize the government's balance sheet in a transparent way, right? Oh, that's too vague. That's not understandable. Like, what's not understandable about that, boys? Like, I don't, you know, what are we doing here? I don't know. Goodness. He pressed you very hard. You were a real one. He's an ultra heavyweight. I mean, again, I was fine that he pressed me. The triggering thing was like, oh, you're not answering my questions. You're vague. It's like, I don't know. I thought I was being pretty, you know, clear, I guess. Maybe I wasn't, but what can you do? Anyway, guys, all right, I'm going to go ahead and end stream. I do have a big announcement on my Twitter, and I've been planning this announcement for a while, so you might want to follow my Twitter for the announcement, if you want. But I've been planning it for a while, so it'll be a big one, guys. But thanks to everyone who donated. Let's go ahead and count up how much we donated, how much we were able to raise for the World Food Program. I think they're doing a specific drive for Palestinian people, so let's count up the donations and see how much we raised real quick, and I'll end the stream with that. Save this anymore. Don't save that. I got lots of Excel sheets open, as usual. All right. All right. From June Noob at the beginning, we got $19.99. Then we got $4.99. Then we got $5. Then we got. Oh wait, hold on. I hope that these currencies. I'll try to understand if these currencies are US dollars. Hopefully these are all converted. We got $4.99. We got $2, $10. Okay, let me scroll down. We got $5, $9.99 from Bad Enchilada. $20 Canadian. So I really don't want to do the conversion. Let's just say let's just pretend it's real money, you know, 20 US dollars. I don't know. $4.99. Then we got another $5 donation. Another €5. Let's just say that that's real money again. Okay, we're kind of smoothing over all these differences. All right, we got $2. $2, and then did I miss another? $5, and then $2. Okay, and then we got 10, and then we got 10. Then we got 5. Then we got $49.99, and then we got $9.99 as my final donation. Oh, sorry, and then another $1.99. Doobie says, I think my only criticism is that you should have pressed them on exactly why they think we shouldn't move in that direction. Yeah, but they already said why. They basically said that they just don't think that it's untested. They think it's just untested, but then I bring up all the examples of public wealth, and they're like, oh, no, that's not the same thing because that's not your ideal. Those aren't examples of what you're talking about. Like, I don't know. I feel like they are, boys. All right, guys. We raised a grand total of $185.92 for the World Food Program. I will go ahead and boost that up to, I don't know, what should I do? I'll go ahead and boost that up to $500. Okay, so I will donate personally $500. And the $185 will be the audience contribution of that $500. So I'll end up having donated, what does that come to? $314.08. I only need this because I'm writing a statement that, again, you guys need to follow my Twitter to follow. We raised insert dollars for the World Food Program. We raised $185.92. I will donate $314.08 myself to bring the total to $500. And then for the rest of my statement, guys, follow my Twitter. But it's a big one, guys. It's shaking things up. Anyway, guys, it was really fun talking. Sorry I got frustrated at moments, but I guess I'm just kind of burnt out. And explaining this to a bunch of people that, I don't know, just don't really seem to be, okay, Insomniac, come on, you're giving me $19 extra. I gotta do all these calculations again. I appreciate it, though. $19 extra. All right, hold on, Jesus. All right, so we raised $205.91. Anybody else donates, I'm going to be pissed if I have to redo this a third time. No, I'm just kidding. Donate as much as you want, guys. Obviously, it's not a big deal to have to redo this. $294.09. And we'll bring it up to $500. Thank you so much for your donation last minute. And yeah, guys, thanks so much for coming out. It's always fun to turn on stream and have people to listen to me. So, hope I did well. Hope you guys hope you guys understood what I was saying. I feel a little bit gaslit. I don't know. Maybe it's